When my apartment burned down, I called my parents for help. My mother simply told me that it was not their problem and that I should have been more careful. But then the fire investigator asked me if I knew who had access to my apartment last week because they found something specific at the scene. What he showed me made my blood run cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive the people who were supposed to protect you. I am Maya, 35 years old, and a financial consultant who spent the last decade building a life completely independent of my family. I stood on the frozen sidewalk at 3 in the morning, clutching my soot-stained robe tightly around my body. The bitter winter wind whipped against my bare legs, but I could barely feel the cold. The intense heat, radiating from the blazing inferno in front of me, was suffocating. My home, my sanctuary, my beautiful historic brownstone was burning to the ground. Thick black smoke billowed into the dark sky, swallowing the stars. Firefighters rushed past me, shouting commands over the deafening roar of the flames and the wailing sirens. Sirens that sounded like the screams tearing through my own mind. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 7 years to afford that property. I had analyzed thousands of financial portfolios, sacrificed vacations, and skipped social events to secure a piece of history in a neighborhood where our people had to fight tooth and nail just to be seen. It was not just a building to me. It was the physical manifestation of my independence from a family that had always viewed me as a disappointment. And now it was turning into ash right before my eyes. My chest heaved as I inhaled the acrid smoke. Panic set in. I had nothing but the robe on my back and my cell phone, which I had grabbed off the nightstand just before the smoke alarms blared. I needed a safe place. I needed my family. My fingers trembled so violently that I dropped the phone twice before I managed to dial my parents' number. They lived 20 minutes away in a sprawling gated estate. I listened to the ringing, praying my mother Brenda would answer with the maternal panic I so desperately craved. The line clicked open. "Yes, Maya, what is it?" Her voice was sharp, laced with sleep and immediate irritation. No panic, no concern, just the familiar tone of a woman inconvenienced by her eldest daughter. "Mom, my house is on fire!" I choked out the words, scraping against my raw throat. "The brownstone is gone. I am standing on the street and I have nothing. I need to come over." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For one brief, foolish second, I thought she was processing the horror of my situation. I thought she was gathering her coat, getting my father Calvin to start the car. Instead, she let out a long, heavy sigh. "Maya, we cannot host you right now." I blinked, staring at the flames devouring my living room windows. "What do you mean you cannot host me, Mom? I am standing outside in freezing weather. Everything I own is burning." "We have a massive day tomorrow," Brenda said, her tone dripping with annoyance. "Trent and Chloe are celebrating their anniversary brunch at the country club. The caterers are arriving at dawn and the guest list is full of your father's most important clients. We absolutely cannot have this kind of chaos disrupting the weekend." "Chaos?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "My house is burning down." "Well, you should have been more careful with your candles," Brenda snapped. "I always told you that your careless lifestyle would catch up with you eventually. We cannot let your irresponsibility ruin your sister's special day. Figure it out." The line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the darkened screen. The roar of the fire seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a ringing in my ears. She hung up on me. My mother had just listened to me tell her my life was going up in flames, and her only concern was an anniversary brunch for my younger sister Chloe and her white husband Trent. I should not have been surprised. Growing up in our affluent household, perfection was the only currency my parents accepted. Chloe was the golden child, the pageant winner who married a wealthy real estate developer. I was the dark-skinned, outspoken daughter who questioned their obsession with country club politics. They had always treated my independence as a personal insult to their carefully curated image. With no other options, I opened my rideshare app. My credit card information was saved, so I managed to book a car to their estate. The driver arrived a few minutes later. He took one look at my tear-streaked, soot-covered face and immediately turned the heat on high, offering me a blanket from his trunk. A complete stranger was showing me more humanity than the woman who gave birth to me. The drive to their gated community felt like a lifetime. The imposing iron gates swung open, revealing the pristine manicured lawns and the massive brick facade of my parents' home. Every window was dark except for the warm, glowing light spilling from the main foyer. They were awake. I stepped out of the car, my bare feet numb against the freezing concrete driveway. I walked up the sweeping stone steps and pressed the doorbell. I waited, shivering uncontrollably. I pressed it again, holding my finger against the button. Finally, the heavy wooden door cracked open. Just a few inches. My father Calvin stood in the narrow gap. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, his expression tight with disapproval. He did not open the door wide enough for me to enter. He did not step forward to wrap his coat around his freezing daughter. He just looked at me like I was a stranger asking for a handout. "Maya, your mother told you not to come," he said, his voice low, trying not to disturb the peace of his perfect house. "Dad, please," I whispered, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely speak. "I am freezing. I just need a place to sleep tonight." He glanced over his shoulder into the brightly lit foyer. Through the narrow opening I could hear laughter. It was Chloe, her bright, bubbly laugh echoing off the marble floors. Then I heard the distinct pop of a champagne bottle. They were awake. They were drinking. They were celebrating the upcoming brunch while I stood on their porch covered in the ashes of my life. "We simply do not have the space for this kind of drama right now," Maya Calvin said, looking back at me. "You need to learn independence. You are 35 years old. It is time you take responsibility for your own mistakes." He reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He pushed it through the crack in the door. "Take this. Go get a hotel room near the airport. We will call you next week when things settle down." I stared at the bill fluttering in his hand. $100. My life had just been destroyed, and my father was handing me a $100 bill to go away and hide so I would not ruin their aesthetic. Before I could react, a shadow fell over my father. Trent stepped into the hallway behind him holding two crystal champagne flutes. Trent with his perfectly styled hair and his arrogant smile. He looked past my father and saw me standing there shaking in the cold. "Maya," Trent called out, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air. "Next time, buy some renter's insurance." Chloe laughed in the background, a sharp, cruel sound that cut deeper than the freezing wind. My father did not scold Trent for his cruelty. He did not tell him to show respect. Instead, Calvin gave me one last look of utter disappointment, dropped the $100 bill onto the welcome mat, and shut the heavy oak door right in my face. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the quiet neighborhood. I stood alone on the porch, staring at the closed door. The $100 bill lay at my feet, mocking me. I did not pick it up. I turned around and walked back down the long driveway, the cold seeping into my very bones. The betrayal was total, absolute, and final. They had prioritized a social event over my survival. They had chosen a performative display of wealth over their own flesh and blood. I ended up calling my best friend Keisha, who immediately drove across town to pick me up. She wrapped me in her winter coat, brought me to her apartment, and held me while I finally broke down and cried. I spent the remainder of the night shivering on her couch, staring at the ceiling, unable to process the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. My family had effectively discarded me, but the grief and the shock were about to be replaced by something much darker. The next morning, the harsh sunlight woke me. I was exhausted, my body aching from the physical trauma and the emotional devastation. My phone vibrated on Keisha's coffee table. It was an unknown number. I sat up, pulling the blanket tight around my shoulders, and answered the call. "Is this Maya?" the deep voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Who is this?" "Who is—" "This is Investigator Sterling with the fire department. I am standing at the site of your brownstone. We need you to come down to the precinct as soon as possible." "Did you find out what happened?" I asked. expecting him to confirm my mother's cruel theory about a forgotten candle or a faulty wire. "Yes, Mom, we did," Sterling said, his tone shifting into something grim and serious. The fire was not an electrical fault. It was not a careless candle. We found traces of a chemical accelerant spread across the main entry points of the property. The fire was set deliberately. My breath caught in my throat. Deliberately. Someone had intentionally burned down my home. Sterling continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you know who had access to your apartment last week, Maya? Because we found something specific at the scene, and we need you to identify it." I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. "What did you find?" "I cannot discuss it over the phone," Sterling said. "But you need to get down here. Whoever did this wanted you out of that building very badly." I ended the call and stood up, dropping the blanket to the floor. The tears from the night before were completely gone. The sadness and the feeling of abandonment evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Someone had tried to destroy me. And based on the chilling events of the previous night, I had a terrible, sickening feeling that the people responsible were the exact same people who had just shut the door in my face. I was standing in the freezing rain, watching everything I owned turn to ash, when my mother told me my burning house was an inconvenience to her country club brunch. But the real betrayal did not come until the fire investigator called the next morning and asked a single question that made my blood run cold. "Who had the keys to your apartment, Maya? Next time buy renter's insurance, Maya." Trent's voice echoed from the massive marble foyer, carrying perfectly through the crisp night air. It was a sharp and condescending bark, followed immediately by Chloe's high-pitched laughter. My father did not turn around to reprimand his son-in-law. He did not ask Trent to show a shred of respect for the fact that I was standing on their porch, shivering violently in a soot-stained robe. Instead, Calvin simply gave me one last look of utter disappointment. He let the crisp $100 bill flutter from his hand onto the welcome mat, and then he shut the heavy oak door right in my face. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the quiet, affluent neighborhood. It was a sound of absolute finality. I stood alone on the sprawling porch, staring at the polished wood of the door. The $100 bill lay at my feet, mocking me in the dim light of the porch sconce. My life had just been destroyed. The historic brownstone I had poured my heart and soul into securing was currently a smoldering pile of rubble surrounded by fire trucks. And my father thought a single piece of currency was sufficient to make his problem go away. I did not bend down to pick it up. My hands were shaking too badly from the freezing temperature and the sheer shock of the rejection. I turned around and began to walk down the long, sweeping driveway. The cold seeped through the thin fabric of my robe, biting into my skin, but the chill radiating from my own family cut much deeper. This was not a new dynamic. I had always been the family scapegoat. I was the dark-skinned, outspoken daughter who questioned their obsession with superficial status. Chloe was the golden child who married Trent, a wealthy white real estate developer, who my parents worshipped as the pinnacle of success. They had always treated my independence as a personal insult to their carefully curated image. My success in financial consulting, my refusal to rely on their wealth, and my determination to buy property in a neighborhood they deemed beneath them were all viewed as acts of rebellion. To them, my house burning down was not a tragedy. It was a validation of their belief that I was chaotic and careless. With numb fingers, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. It was the only possession I had managed to save before the smoke alarms drove me out into the street. I dialed the only person I knew would actually answer. Keisha picked up on the second ring. When she heard my voice cracking and trembling as I explained where I was and what had happened, she did not ask questions or make excuses. She simply told me she was on her way and ordered me to keep moving to stay warm. 10 minutes later, Keisha's familiar sedan pulled up to the curb outside my parents' gated community. She threw the car into park and ran out, leaving the door open. When she saw me covered in ash and shivering uncontrollably, she stripped off her heavy winter coat and wrapped it tightly around my shoulders. She guided me into the passenger seat, turning the heater up to its maximum setting. As we drove away from the pristine mansions and manicured lawns, I finally let out the tears I had been holding back. I told her about the fire, the smoke, the sheer terror of waking up to a world in flames. And then I told her about the phone call with my mother and the moment my father shut the door in my face. Keisha's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. She cursed my parents and Trent with a fierce, protective anger that made me sob harder. "That is exactly why you built your own life, Maya," she told me, her voice thick with emotion. "They do not deserve you. They never have. We are going to my place, and you are going to stay for as long as you need. We will figure this out together." The contrast between my chosen family and my blood family was staggering. My parents, who possessed immense wealth and a mansion with 5 empty guest bedrooms, had handed me $100 bill and told me to go away. Keisha, who worked a modest job and lived in a small one-bedroom apartment, was giving me her coat, her home, and her absolute loyalty without a second's hesitation. We arrived at her apartment, and she immediately guided me to the bathroom. She handed me a stack of clean towels and her softest pajamas. Standing under the hot spray of the shower, I watched the gray and black soot wash off my skin and swirl down the drain. It smelled like destruction. The acrid scent of burning wood and melting plastic clung to my hair. I scrubbed myself until my skin was raw, trying to wash away the memory of the flames, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the orange glow eating through my living room ceiling. When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, Keisha had made a bed for me on her comfortable sofa, complete with extra blankets and a cup of hot tea waiting on the side table. I lay down on the couch, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The physical shock was slowly beginning to wear off, making room for the crushing weight of reality. I mentally cataloged everything I had lost. My clothes, my furniture, the antique desk I had restored myself, the family photos from before things got so toxic. But mostly, I mourned the brownstone itself. I had refused to sell that property for years. It was located right in the middle of a rapidly gentrifying commercial block, and developers had been circling like vultures. Even Trent had tried to buy it from me a few months ago, offering a ridiculously low sum and acting like he was doing me a massive favor. I had practically laughed him out of my office. Now the property was nothing but a charred lot. I stared at the shadows on Keisha's ceiling until exhaustion finally dragged me into a fitful, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of brewing coffee. Sunlight was streaming through the blinds, painting bright stripes across the living room floor. For a brief, disorienting second, I forgot what had happened. Then, the smell of smoke lingering on my discarded robe brought everything crashing back. I sat up, feeling a deep ache in my chest. Keisha walked into the room, handing me a mug of coffee. She had already pulled out her laptop and a notepad, ready to help me start making the necessary calls to my insurance company and the bank. Before I could even take a sip of the coffee, my cell phone buzzed on the table. The screen displayed an unknown local number. My heart skipped a beat, thinking it might be my parents finally calling to check if I had survived the night. I cleared my throat and answered the call. "Is this Maya?" the deep voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Who is this?" "This is Investigator Sterling with the fire department. I am standing at the site of your brownstone right now. We need you to come down to the precinct as soon as possible." I gripped the coffee mug tightly, the warmth seeping into my palms. "Did you find out what happened?" I asked, fully expecting him to confirm my mother's cruel theory about a forgotten candle or a faulty wire. I was already bracing myself to defend my own innocence. "Yes, Mom, we did," Sterling said, his tone shifting into something grim and entirely serious. "The fire was not an electrical fault. It was not a careless candle or a space heater. We found clear traces of a chemical accelerant spread strategically across the main entry points and structural supports of the property." My breath caught in my throat. The words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Chemical accelerant. "The fire was set deliberately." Sterling continued, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of Keisha's apartment. "Maya, do you know who had access to your apartment last week? Because we found something very specific at the scene. It survived the blaze and we need you to come down here and identify it. Whoever did this wanted you out of that building very badly. I lowered the phone slightly, staring blankly at the wall. Deliberately. Someone had intentionally set fire to my home while I was sleeping inside. Someone had tried to kill me or at the very least destroy everything I had built. And based on the chilling events of the previous night, the mockery from Trent, the immediate gaslighting from my mother, the absolute refusal to offer me shelter, I had a terrible, sickening feeling creeping into my stomach. My brownstone sat on the exact commercial zoning block that Trent's failing real estate company desperately needed to acquire. The pieces were starting to align in a way that made my blood run cold. I drove straight from Keisha's apartment to the Oak Ridge Country Club. The entire ride across the city felt like a surreal nightmare. I was wearing Keisha's oversized gray sweatpants and a faded college hoodie that hung loosely off my shoulders. My hair was tied back in a messy knot, and my skin still felt tight and raw from the blistering heat of my burning brownstone. The acrid smell of chemical smoke was embedded deep in my pores, acting as a constant sickening reminder of the terror I had barely escaped just hours before. Walking through the polished mahogany doors of the club, I completely ignored the glaring stares of the valet and the hostess. The crystal chandeliers above me sparkled mockingly, casting bright light across the pristine marble floors. My family had rented out the private solarium for Trent and Chloe's highly anticipated 5-year anniversary brunch. As I approached the heavy glass double doors, I could hear the clinking of expensive mimosa glasses and the loud, pretentious laughter of my mother's elite social circle. I pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in bright morning sunlight, highlighting the extravagant white floral arrangements on every single table. Brenda, my mother, was holding court at the head table. She wore a tailored ivory suit, looking like the absolute picture of wealthy suburban perfection. My father, Calvin, sat quietly beside her, sipping a Bloody Mary and checking his expensive watch. Chloe and Trent sat across from them, eagerly tearing into silver-wrapped gifts. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the reality of the scene sink deep into my chest. Less than 8 hours ago, I had been standing in the freezing cold watching my entire life turn to ash. I had begged for shelter and had been cruelly denied by these exact people. And now, thanks to the chilling phone call from Investigator Sterling, I knew the fire was not an accident. I knew about the chemical accelerant. I knew Trent had a desperate motive to clear my brownstone out of his coveted commercial zoning block. I stepped into the room ready to demand answers, to scream the absolute truth about the arson, until someone called the police. But Brenda saw me first. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, my mother stood up. Her eyes darted over my borrowed clothes and her face contorted into a mask of theatrical pity. She did not rush over to hug me. She did not ask if I was physically unharmed or if I needed medical attention. Instead, she raised her voice, ensuring that every affluent friend and country club acquaintance in the solarium could hear her perfectly. "Oh, Maya, darling, you actually came," Brenda announced, her tone dripping with a sickening sweet condescension. "Everyone, please make room for my eldest daughter. We are just so devastated for her." I told her 100 times that living in that old cramped building was a serious safety hazard. But Maya has always insisted on her careless, chaotic lifestyle, and now look what has happened. I stood frozen in the center of the room. The cheerful conversations around me died down instantly. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at me, taking in my soot-stained fingernails and baggy sweatpants. Brenda was controlling the narrative before I could even establish my presence. She was actively painting me as the negligent architect of my own tragedy. "Mom," I said, my voice tight with suppressed rage. "The fire was not an accident. The investigator just called me. They found traces of a chemical accelerant spread across the property." Brenda loudly clapped her hands together, cutting me off completely. "Oh, Maya, please let us not do this right now. We know you are in shock. You left a candle burning, or you left your hair straightener plugged in. It happens to people who refuse to slow down and organize their lives. We are not angry with you, honey. We just want you to learn from this massive mistake." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. She was gaslighting me in front of 30 people. She was burying the horrific truth under a mountain of fake maternal concern. I opened my mouth to shout over her to tell everyone in that room that her precious son-in-law likely hired someone to torch my home. But then Trent stood up. Trent adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit and walked over to me wearing a look of deep, patronizing sympathy. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. I tried to shake it off, but his grip was surprisingly firm, digging painfully into my collarbone. "Maya, we are all family here," Trent said, his voice projecting across the silent dining room. "We know you are struggling. We know your financial consulting firm has not been doing as well as you pretend it is. And now, with your house gone, you are facing total financial ruin. But you do not have to lash out and invent wild stories about chemical fires to avoid taking the blame." I looked up at him, my vision tunneling with pure rage. My firm was highly successful. I managed portfolios that completely dwarfed his struggling real estate company, but he was deliberately weaponizing the moment, treating me like a charity case to elevate his own status. "Listen to me," Maya Trent continued, stepping closer, so his expensive cologne masked the faint smell of smoke still clinging to my skin. "I am going to help you out. I know you do not have a lot of liquid assets right now. I know you probably skipped out on premium insurance coverage because you wanted to save a few bucks. But I am going to sit down with you next week and teach you how to appropriately budget. I will help you build a responsible financial plan so you do not end up homeless again. It will be my anniversary gift to the family." The room broke into a soft chorus of appreciative murmurs. The wealthy guests nodded at each other, whispering about what a generous and upstanding man Chloe had married. I felt a surge of pure, unfiltered hatred. Trent was the man who likely orchestrated the destruction of my home just hours ago. Now he was using my devastation to play the magnanimous savior in front of the local elite. He was systematically stripping away my professional dignity and framing me as an incompetent beggar. I shoved Trent's hand off my shoulder, taking a heavy step back. "Keep your hands off me, Trent!" I snapped, my voice carrying a dangerous, unyielding edge. "I do not need your financial advice. My firm is thriving. My house was deliberately targeted, and you know exactly why it was targeted." Chloe let out a loud, exasperated sigh from the head table. She dropped a diamond tennis bracelet back into its velvet box and glared at me with pure venom. "Maya, seriously, can you stop making everything about you for just one single morning? Trent and I are trying to celebrate 5 years of marriage, and you show up looking like a vagrant screaming conspiracy theories. You ruined your own house. Do not ruin my brunch too." I turned to my father, hoping for a single ounce of reason. "Dad, you cannot possibly believe this narrative," I said. "You cannot stand there and let them humiliate me when I nearly died last night." Calvin finally set down his glass. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and fixed me with a cold, calculating stare that chilled me to the bone. "Maya, your sister is right. You are acting completely unhinged. Your mother told you to get a hotel room last night and get some rest. Instead, you come barging in here smelling like a campfire, disrupting a private, catered event. If you cannot behave like a rational adult and accept the help Trent is generously offering, then you can leave right now. And if you continue to spread these insane criminal accusations to cover up your own negligence, I will have no choice but to cut you out of the family trust entirely. We will not allow your chaotic drama to tarnish this family's pristine reputation." I looked at the four of them. My mother with her fake theatrical pity. My sister with her selfish, unbridled annoyance. My father with his ruthless financial threats. And Trent with his smug, victorious smile. They were a united front. They had built an impenetrable wall of gaslighting and psychological warfare. If I accused Trent of arson right now without ironclad physical evidence, I would look exactly like the crazy, negligent daughter they were claiming I was. They would have me escorted out by country club security, and the narrative would be set in stone forever. I needed to be smarter. I needed to play their sick, twisted game until I held all the cards. I forced my rigid shoulders to drop. I unclenched my fists and took a deep, steadying breath, playing the part of the defeated, exhausted victim they desperately wanted me to be. "Fine," I whispered, keeping my eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor. "I am sorry for disrupting the anniversary brunch. I am just tired and confused. I will go." A collective sigh of relief washed over the entire solarium. Brenda smiled victoriously, turning back to her wealthy friends to resume her gossiping as if I had never arrived. Trent gave my arm one last patronizing pat before returning to his seat to accept the adulation of his peers. A waiter approached me tentatively, carrying a silver tray with a single cup of black coffee that someone had apparently ordered for me out of profound pity. He held out a small leather folder containing the check for the coffee. I refused to let my family pay for anything of mine. I refused to accept a single cent of their toxic charity. I reached into the pocket of Keisha's oversized sweatpants and pulled out my cell phone. I opened my digital wallet app to simply tap and pay for the overpriced drink and leave this nightmare behind me. But as the screen illuminated, a bright red notification banner pushed its way to the top of my phone, blocking everything else. It was an urgent, high-priority alert from my property insurance provider. I tapped the message, expecting to see a standard update on my emergency housing funds or claim assignment. Instead, the words on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. "Notice of claim suspension. Your primary insurance claim for property damage has been officially frozen, pending an active fraud investigation. We have received an anonymous tip indicating that you are in massive undisclosed debt and intentionally destroyed your own property for the financial payout. All emergency funds and payouts are halted immediately pending police review." I stood frozen in the middle of the crowded country club, staring at the terrifying words illuminating my screen. I was completely cut off. I had no home, no clothes, and now no insurance money to rebuild my life. I looked up slowly, meeting Trent's eyes across the room. He raised his mimosa glass in a silent, mocking toast. Someone had intentionally set me up to take the fall for the arson, and that someone was sitting right in front of me. The bright red notification glaring against the sleek screen of my phone felt like a second physical blow. I read the words again and again, trying to force my exhausted brain to comprehend the message. Claim suspended. Fraud investigation. Anonymous tip. The air in the private solarium suddenly felt too thin to breathe. An anonymous tip had been called in claiming I was drowning in undisclosed debt and had intentionally torched my own historic brownstone for a quick insurance payout. I stared at the digital text while the ambient noise of the country club brunch buzzed around me like a swarm of angry bees. The clinking of fine crystal, the soft hum of classical music piped in through hidden speakers, the arrogant laughter of my brother-in-law holding court at the head table. Anonymous. The word echoed in my mind, bouncing against the walls of my skull. Who would know the details of my insurance policy? Who would know exactly which agency to call on a Sunday morning? And more importantly, who would benefit from painting me as a desperate criminal? I slowly lowered the phone. I looked across the expanse of white linen and elaborate floral centerpieces directly at Trent. He was taking a casual sip of his mimosa, his eyes crinkling with manufactured joy. Beside him, Chloe was adjusting a diamond earring, looking utterly bored by the surrounding conversation. My mother, Brenda, was busy signaling a waiter for a refill, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just publicly humiliated her eldest daughter. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white from the pressure. The leather folder containing the coffee check sat ignored between us. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a cold, piercing clarity that sliced right through the cheerful chatter. Who made the call? The conversation at our immediate table faltered. Calvin, my father, lowered his Bloody Mary and frowned at me. "What are you talking about now, Maya?" he demanded, his tone laced with exhaustion, as if my mere presence was an unbearable chore. I stepped closer to the table, refusing to break eye contact with Trent. "My insurance claim was just frozen," I stated, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the white tablecloth. "An anonymous tip was called in less than an hour ago." The caller told my insurance provider that I am in massive undisclosed debt and that I intentionally burned down my own home for the payout. Brenda let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. Oh my goodness! Maya, are you serious? Chloe rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in her head. See, Mom? I told you she was hiding something, Chloe snapped, setting her champagne flute down with a sharp clink. She has been acting erratic for months, refusing to come to family dinners, hoarding that crumbling old property in the city. It all makes sense now. I whipped my head to look at my sister. It makes sense. You think I burned down my own house? You think I nearly killed myself in a chemical fire to cash an insurance check? Trent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. He adopted that same, sickeningly patient tone he had used minutes earlier. Maya, no one is saying you wanted to hurt yourself. But financial stress makes people do crazy things. We all know the consulting market has been volatile. If you were over-leveraged, if you took on debts you could not handle, things might have spiraled out of your control. You do not have to lie to us. We are your family. We want to help you fix this. I stared at him, feeling a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. He was too smooth. He had the narrative entirely prepared. He was projecting a motive onto me with such seamless execution that a terrifying realization washed over me. He did not just hire someone to set the fire. He made the phone call. The phone. You called them, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You called my insurance company. Trent's eyes widened in a picture-perfect display of wounded innocence. Maya, that is a horrible accusation. Why would I do something like that? I was just offering to help you budget. Brenda slammed her palm down on the table, rattling the expensive silverware. Maya, that is enough. Your brother-in-law offers you financial salvation, and you accuse him of sabotage. You are completely out of control. You have always been jealous of Chloe's stability and Trent's success. But to stand here and accuse him of a federal crime to cover up your own financial mess is a new low even for you. I am not in a financial mess. Mom, I fired back, my pulse pounding rapidly in my ears. My consulting firm is turning record profits. I own that brownstone outright. I have zero debt. You know this. Dad knows this. He handles the trust taxes. Calvin had remained silent, observing the exchange with narrowed eyes. Now he shifted in his chair, leaning his considerable frame forward. The patriarchal hammer was about to drop. Actually, Maya, I do not know that, Calvin said, his voice dangerously quiet. What I do know is that you have always been reckless. You insist on living in dangerous neighborhoods to prove some ridiculous point about independence. You surround yourself with chaotic elements. And now you are standing in a respectable establishment, wearing sweatpants, shouting conspiracy theories at a man who has done nothing but try to elevate this family. He paused, letting his cruel words hang heavy in the warm morning air. Let me make something very clear to you, Calvin continued. The authorities are going to investigate this fire. If they find out that you committed arson for an insurance payout, you will face prison time. And I will not allow you to drag the family name through the mud during a highly publicized criminal trial. I stared at the man who had taught me how to ride a bike, the man who had once told me I could achieve anything. He was looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. What are you saying, Dad? I am saying that if you continue down this path of denying responsibility and hurling wild accusations at Trent, I will immediately remove you from the family trust, Calvin stated. His voice did not waver for a fraction of a second. I will sever all financial and legal ties between you and this family. We will issue a public statement distancing ourselves from your actions to protect Trent's company and your mother's social standing. You will face this fraud investigation completely alone. The air left my lungs in a sudden rush. He was not just abandoning me to the ashes of my home. He was actively threatening to destroy me if I dared to expose the truth. They were closing ranks entirely around Trent, Trent, who had the right skin color, the right country club pedigree, and the right kind of superficial wealth. In their eyes, Trent was the son they always wanted, and I was just the difficult daughter who refused to conform to their country club aesthetic. Chloe reached over and patted Trent's hand, throwing me a smug, victorious look. "You should probably leave now, Maya," Chloe said, her voice laced with poison. "You have a lot of legal problems to figure out, and frankly, you are ruining my appetite." I did not scream. I did not flip the table or throw the coffee in Trent's smug face. The raw, burning anger that had consumed me since I walked through the mahogany doors suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. Ice. Pure, calculated ice. I realized in that single breathtaking moment that arguing with them was completely pointless. They did not care about the truth. They cared about the narrative. They cared about power. And right now, they believed they held all the power in the room. They believed I was a broken, destitute woman who was about to be buried under a criminal fraud investigation. They believed they had won. I slowly stepped back from the table. I looked at Brenda, who was aggressively avoiding my gaze, pretending to adjust her napkin. I looked at Calvin, whose jaw was set in rigid, patriarchal defiance. I looked at Chloe and Trent, who were already turning their attention back to their champagne flutes, like I had already ceased to exist. I let their insults, their threats, and their staggering betrayal wash over me, settling deep into my bones. I would not forget a single word. My phone vibrated heavily in my palm, buzzing insistently against my skin. I did not break eye contact with Trent as I lifted the device and swiped open the screen. It was a direct message from Investigator Sterling. The text was brief, urgent, and completely changed the trajectory of my entire life. "I need you down at the precinct immediately," Sterling wrote. "We traced the source of the anonymous tip to a burner phone, but we managed to pull the security camera footage from the convenience store where the device was purchased yesterday afternoon. You need to see who bought it." I stared at the message, taking a slow, deep breath. A dark, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked back at Trent, whose own smile faltered slightly at my sudden change in demeanor. I slipped the phone into my pocket. "Enjoy your brunch," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, absolute calm. "I have somewhere to be." I turned on my heel and walked out of the solarium without looking back. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating hum of elite entitlement and the clinking of champagne flutes. I marched through the marble lobby, ignoring the shocked expression of the concierge, who was staring at my soot-stained sweatpants. The cold morning air hit my face as I stepped out from beneath the grand awning, but I barely registered the freezing temperature. The adrenaline pumping through my veins burned hotter than the fire that had consumed my home. I pulled my phone from my pocket and ordered a car to the precinct. As I stood at the edge of the sprawling manicured driveway waiting for my ride, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The family I had spent 35 years trying to appease no longer existed to me. They had chosen their side. They had chosen the wealthy, arrogant son-in-law over their own flesh and blood. Now I was going to choose myself. The driver pulled up and I slid into the back seat, staring out the window as the opulent gates of the country club faded into the distance. The ride across town felt simultaneously instantaneous and agonizingly slow. I was heading toward the absolute truth, and there was no turning back. The police precinct was a stark, brutalist contrast to the sunlit luxury I had just escaped. The building was composed of gray concrete and harsh fluorescent lighting, casting long institutional shadows across the scuffed linoleum floors. The air smelled of stale coffee floor wax and pure exhaustion. I approached the front desk, my borrowed clothes clinging to my frame, and stated my name. The desk sergeant gave me a brief, sympathetic nod and picked up his radio. Less than 2 minutes later, a tall, broad-shouldered man pushed through a set of heavy wooden doors. Investigator Sterling had sharp, observant eyes set into a deeply lined face that spoke of too many late nights and too many tragic crime scenes. He wore a rumpled gray suit and carried a thick manila folder tucked firmly under his arm. "Maya," he said, extending a rough, calloused hand. I appreciate you getting down here so quickly. Follow me. I shook his hand and followed him through the labyrinth of cubicles and ringing telephones. We entered a small windowless interview room. A single metal table sat in the center, flanked by two rigid plastic chairs. Sterling gestured for me to sit and took the seat directly across from me. He placed the heavy manila folder on the table between us. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy vacuum waiting to be filled with the devastating reality of my ruined life. Sterling leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He treated me like an intelligent adult capable of handling the facts. As I mentioned on the phone, the blaze at your brownstone was not an accident. Sterling began, his voice low and measured. The fire department lab confirmed the presence of a highly combustible industrial solvent. It was poured deliberately along the baseboards of your living room, the bottom of the main staircase, and directly outside your bedroom door. Whoever did this was trying to trap you upstairs. They wanted the fire to spread fast, and they wanted to cut off your primary escape routes. I swallowed hard, tasting ash in the back of my throat. The calculated malice of the act was staggering. I had barely made it out through the fire escape window. If I had woken up just 2 minutes later, I would have been burned alive in my own bed. You said you found something, I prompted, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the violent trembling in my hands. You said you needed me to identify it. Sterling nodded slowly. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and withdrew a clear plastic evidence bag. He placed it carefully on the metal table and slid it across the cold surface until it rested directly in front of me. Inside the sealed plastic was a piece of metal. It was blackened, charred, and partially melted from the extreme heat of the inferno, but its fundamental shape remained intact. We found this in the narrow alleyway right behind your property near the back door, Sterling explained, watching my face with intense, unwavering focus. It was resting in a puddle of water, where the fire hoses had washed away the debris. It looks like the perpetrator dropped it while fleeing the scene. Do you recognize it, Maya? I leaned forward, staring through the thick plastic. My breath hitched sharply in my chest. The object was a money clip, but it was not just any generic piece of metal. It was heavy brushed titanium with a very distinct angled geometric edge. Even beneath the thick layer of soot and the structural warping from the fire, I could see the faint outline of a custom engraving. 3 small, precise initials stamped into the bottom right corner. TRC, Trent Robert Caldwell. The air rushed out of my lungs as if I had been punched directly in the stomach. The sick, terrifying feeling that had been brewing inside me since I stood on my parents' porch suddenly crystallized into absolute, undeniable fact. I knew exactly what this object was because I was the one who had bought it. Last year, for Trent's 30th birthday, my mother had relentlessly badgered me to purchase him something impressive to welcome him into the family. I had spent $800 on that limited edition, custom-engraved titanium money clip. I had handed it to him wrapped in silver paper, and he had smirked, making a condescending joke about how surprised he was that a single independent woman could afford such a luxury item. I recognize it. I whispered the words, scraping against my raw throat. I bought it. It belongs to my brother-in-law, Trent Caldwell. Sterling did not look surprised. He simply opened his manila folder and began extracting a series of printed photographs. Trent Caldwell, the real estate developer, he verified, sliding the first photograph across the table. Yes, I confirmed, pulling my eyes away from the charred evidence bag to look at the investigator. My brownstone is located right in the middle of the commercial zoning block his company has been desperately trying to acquire for the past 2 years. I refused to sell. He offered me a buyout 3 months ago, and I turned him down flat. He needs my property to complete his commercial plaza project. If my building is condemned or destroyed, he can swoop in and buy the land at an absolute fraction of the cost from the city. Sterling nodded, absorbing the information with a grim expression. That aligns perfectly with what we discovered this morning, he said. After we found the clip, our tech team immediately pulled the traffic camera footage from the intersection adjoining your alleyway. We were looking for any vehicles leaving the area in a hurry around 3 in the morning. He laid 3 high-resolution gloss photographs on the table. They were sequential stills captured by a municipal traffic camera. The timestamp in the bottom corner of the first photo read 2:48 a.m., exactly 12 minutes before my smoke alarm started screaming. The images showed a large luxury SUV idling in the shadows just at the mouth of my alleyway. The streetlights caught the distinct sleek lines of the vehicle. It was a custom matte black Range Rover with highly specific aftermarket chrome rims. The exact same vehicle Trent drove to every single family dinner. The exact same vehicle I had seen parked at the country club less than an hour ago. The second photo showed the vehicle pulling out of the alleyway, accelerating rapidly into the intersection. The timestamp read 2:56 a.m., 4 minutes before the fire erupted. The third photograph was a zoomed-in enhanced crop of the vehicle's rear license plate. The glare of the street lamp obscured one of the numbers, but the first 4 characters were crystal clear. They matched Trent's custom vanity plates perfectly. "Is this his vehicle?" Sterling asked, tapping the enhanced photograph with a pen. "Yes," I said, my voice growing stronger, fueled by the burning clarity of the evidence. "That is Trent's SUV. He loves bragging about those custom chrome rims. He drove it to the Oak Ridge Country Club this morning. It is parked in the VIP lot right now." Sterling leaned back in his rigid plastic chair, folding his hands across his stomach. "We traced the anonymous tip that froze your insurance claim to Maya. The call was made from a prepaid burner phone purchased at a gas station 3 miles from your parents' gated community. We pulled the convenience store security footage. The person who bought the phone paid in cash and wore a heavy hood, but the camera caught his wrist when he handed the cashier the money. He was wearing a silver Rolex, the exact same model Trent Caldwell wears in all his public press photos." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. Trent had orchestrated the entire thing. He had driven to my house, poured industrial solvent through my home, and lit the match. He had dropped his money clip in his panicked rush to escape the flames. He had driven away, leaving me to burn alive. And then, just to ensure I could not rebuild, he had driven to a gas station, bought a burner phone, and completely nuked my insurance claim by accusing me of fraud. He wanted me destitute, desperate, and completely out of the way, and my parents were willing to disown me to protect him. Sterling leaned forward again, his expression darkening into something deeply intense. "We have the motive. We have his vehicle fleeing the scene. We have the physical evidence he dropped in the alley. But there is one major piece of this puzzle missing, Maya." I opened my eyes, meeting his sharp gaze. "What is it?" "The fire department determined that the accelerant was poured deliberately along the inside of your hallways," Sterling explained, keeping his voice low. "But the front door was locked. The back door was locked. The deadbolts were perfectly intact. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry on any of the windows or doors. Whoever set this fire did not break in. They walked right through your front door." Sterling paused, letting the weight of the realization hang in the small, sterile room. "Did Trent Caldwell have a key to your brownstone, Maya?" I stared at the burned titanium clip sitting on the metal table. My mind raced, racing through every interaction, every family dinner, every single time Trent had visited my home. I had never given him a key. I guarded my independence fiercely. I would never give that arrogant man access to my sanctuary. "No!" I whispered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as the final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I never gave Trent a key. But last month, when I went out of town for a financial conference, I gave an emergency spare key to my sister. I gave the only existing spare key directly to Chloe. The betrayal was total, absolute, and chillingly complete. My sister had handed her husband the key to my destruction. I stared at the terrifying notification on my phone, while the country club anniversary brunch buzzed around me like angry bees. My primary property insurance claim was officially frozen, pending an active fraud investigation. An anonymous tip maliciously claimed I was drowning in massive debt and had intentionally torched my brownstone for a quick payout. I stood frozen in the opulent marble solarium, surrounded by clinking mimosa glasses. I looked across the pristine tablecloth at Trent, who was casually taking a sip of his expensive champagne. His eyes crinkled with manufactured joy, but I caught the briefest flicker of a smug victory hiding beneath his polished veneer. He had made the call. He orchestrated my financial ruin to ensure I was completely helpless and desperate. Beside him, Chloe was adjusting a diamond earring, looking utterly bored by the surrounding conversation. My mother, Brenda, was signaling a waiter completely unbothered that she had just publicly humiliated her daughter. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white from the pressure. I did not scream or flip the table. I did not hurl the coffee into Trent's face or demand the truth. I just stared at them, letting a cold, piercing clarity cut through the burning anger in my chest. Confronting them right now without undeniable physical evidence would only validate their toxic narrative. They would eagerly paint me as an unhinged woman, desperately lashing out to avoid taking responsibility for her own tragic negligence. I needed to be much smarter. I needed to completely obliterate them. I did not confront them yet. Instead, I dropped my shoulders and unclenched my fists, playing the defeated victim they wanted. I turned and walked out of the country club without uttering a single word. The heavy glass doors swung shut, cutting off the suffocating hum of elite entitlement. I marched through the lobby, ignoring the shocked concierge, and stepped out into the freezing morning air. I immediately hailed a private car to my downtown financial consulting firm. It was Sunday, meaning the high-rise building was completely deserted. The heavy silence of my empty office floor was exactly what I required to work. I locked my office door behind me and sat down at my mahogany desk. I booted up my secure workstation and bypassed the standard search engines regular citizens used. As a senior financial consultant, I possessed authorized access to elite forensic accounting software. This system was utilized by federal regulators to trace hidden assets and unravel complex corporate structures. I cracked my knuckles and typed Caldwell Developments into the Global Corporate Registry database. For years, Trent paraded around family dinners boasting about his massive property acquisitions and booming profit margins. My parents had always treated his arrogant words like absolute gospel. They weaponized his perceived success to highlight my supposed financial failures and lifestyle choices. Looking at the unfiltered data pulling across my screens, the magnificent facade instantly crumbled into dust. Caldwell Developments was not a thriving real estate empire dominating the state. It was a house of cards teetering on the edge of total financial collapse. I pulled up the private ledger filings and watched a cascade of red numbers flood my monitor. Trent was drowning in insurmountable debt. He had recklessly overleveraged his initial venture capital to secure multiple high-interest bridging loans from aggressive secondary lenders. The deeper I dug into the encrypted records, the worse the reality became. He had defaulted on 3 major commercial construction payments in the last 4 months alone. His primary company was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, hiding massive consecutive losses behind a complex web of obscure shell companies registered in Delaware. The luxurious country club brunch and the custom SUV were entirely financed by massive lines of credit he could not repay. He was functionally bankrupt in every conceivable metric. His entire life was a carefully constructed, heavily mortgaged lie. Knowing he was broke was deeply satisfying, but it did not fully explain the arson. I needed to understand exactly why he targeted my specific home. I opened a new secure tab and pulled up the city's municipal planning records, cross-referencing them with Caldwell Development's active project filings. Filtering through stalled projects, I found a master development plan submitted to the city council under one of his obscure shell companies. The ambitious project was titled the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza. It was an extensive multi-million-dollar proposal for a luxury complex, promising to save his sinking portfolio and repay his lenders. I downloaded the highly detailed architectural blueprints and opened my geographic mapping software. I overlaid the proposed Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza project map with the city's current commercial zoning boundaries. A cold realization washed over me as the digital map rendered the final image. There, sitting dead in the absolute center of his massive proposed commercial block, was my historic brownstone. My property was the literal physical linchpin of his entire development strategy. Without my specific plot of land, the architectural footprint fundamentally failed strict city zoning codes. If he did not secure my lot, the entire plaza project would be denied, causing his lenders to aggressively liquidate his remaining assets. I leaned back in my chair, my mind instantly flashing back to a tense conversation we had 3 months ago. Trent had cornered me at a family barbecue, offering to buy my brownstone for a ridiculously insulting lowball sum. He had arrogantly framed the terrible offer as a massive personal favor to me. He claimed he was generously taking a deteriorating property off my hands before maintenance costs drained my finances. I had flatly refused his insulting offer, telling him the building was my beloved home and was entirely off the market. He smiled tightly and walked away, but I remembered the brief flash of pure panic in his eyes. He was not trying to do me a favor at that barbecue. He was completely and utterly desperate. Because I refused to sell, his investors were actively preparing to pull their funding and force his company into immediate bankruptcy. He desperately needed my physical property wiped off that commercial block. Since he could not buy the building from me legally, his only remaining option was to burn it to the ground. Once my property was reduced to a condemned pile of ash, the city would automatically force a mandatory distressed public sale. This would smoothly allow his shell company to swoop in and purchase the charred lot for mere pennies. He tried to kill me while I slept, just to save his own bank account. The sociopathic calculation of the arson plot was staggering. He had driven his SUV into my alleyway, used his wife's spare key to bypass the deadbolts, and poured industrial accelerant through my hallways. Then he had the audacity to stand in the country club this morning and offer patronizing financial advice while my life went up in smoke. He had treated me like a charity case, knowing full well he was the architect of my total devastation. I felt a grim, vicious satisfaction knowing I was about to completely destroy his life. But my investigation was not quite finished. I needed to secure the final piece of the puzzle. I stared at the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza investor prospectus, scrolling through the list of initial financial backers. My eyes scanned the names, analyzing the elite business owners, hedge fund managers, and private equity firms who contributed massive capital to his fraudulent enterprise. I was looking for the specific secondary lenders threatening to break his kneecaps over defaulted payments. I read through page after page of encrypted financial commitments and corporate trust allocations. The data was dense and intentionally obfuscated, but my trained eyes cut through the corporate jargon and hidden accounting tricks. And then I stopped completely. My breath hitched sharply in my throat, and my hand froze rigidly on the mouse. I stared at a single line of data halfway down page 42 of the investor prospectus. Tucked near the bottom of the secondary investor list, shielded by a generic corporate trust name, was an entity I recognized instantly. It was a specific, unique trust account routing number I had personally seen listed on my father's annual tax documents years ago. I blinked hard, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the black numbers on the screen remained entirely unchanged. The digital trail was absolute and undeniable. Calvin, my own father, was the primary silent financial backer of Trent's massive real estate project. My father had millions of his own dollars directly tied up in it. The exact commercial development absolutely required my home to be destroyed. The horrifying, crushing reality washed over me, completely shattering everything I thought I ever knew about my own blood. I now realize with absolute certainty that this was not just Trent acting alone against me. I desperately need to know exactly how deep the family rot truly goes. I stared at the name on the screen. Calvin, my father, the patriarch who demanded absolute perfection and punished any perceived failure with icy silence. He was the silent backer. He was the money behind my destruction. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as a sickening realization took hold. If my father was financing the Oak Ridge Plaza, he knew exactly what was required to build it. He knew my brownstone stood directly in the middle of his investment. But did my mother know? Did my sister know? I needed absolute proof of their complicity. I needed to see their private conversations to understand the true depth of this betrayal. 5 years ago, when my parents upgraded their sprawling estate, I was the one who configured their entire digital infrastructure. I set up their shared family cloud storage to synchronize their calendars, financial documents, and personal emails. I had created the master administrative account, and I had never deleted my access credentials. They were technologically illiterate enough to assume that changing their basic passwords would lock me out of the master administrative console. They were entirely wrong. I opened a new incognito browser and accessed the backend of the family cloud server. The login screen prompted me for the master override key. I typed in the 32-character alphanumeric string I had committed to memory half a decade ago. The system smoothly bypassed their two-factor authentication protocols and granted me absolute access to every single file they possessed. I was inside. The dashboard populated with individual folders for Calvin, Brenda, Chloe, and Trent. I routed all of their synchronized email archives into a single searchable database on my secure workstation server. I typed the keyword Oak Ridge into the primary search bar and hit enter. The system instantly returned over 400 deeply encrypted emails exchanged between the four of them over the past 8 months. I utilized my firm's high-level decryption software to crack the file protection. The software chewed through their basic encryption in less than 40 seconds. The raw, unredacted text flooded my screen. I clicked on the oldest email in the chain dated 8 months ago. It was a frantic message from Trent to my father, begging for a massive influx of capital to stop his secondary lenders from seizing his company. Trent's tone was pathetic and desperate, completely contradicting the arrogant persona he projected at our family dinners. My father's response was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. He berated Trent for his reckless spending, his poor project management, and his sheer incompetence. But ultimately, Calvin agreed to leverage the family trust to bail him out. Calvin explicitly stated that the Caldwell legacy could not afford the public humiliation of a catastrophic bankruptcy. He tied his own financial reputation directly to Trent's survival. I scrolled forward through the timeline, watching the panic escalate as the city zoning board rejected their initial project proposals. The city demanded a contiguous commercial block for the plaza to proceed. That was when my brownstone entered their crosshairs. I opened a chain labeled Property Acquisition Strategy. It was an exchange between all four of them. Trent complained bitterly about my outright refusal to accept his insulting lowball offer. He called me stubborn, irrational, and completely blind to the realities of modern urban development. Chloe's response made my blood run entirely cold. She wrote that I was a bitter spinster hoarding a crumbling property just to spite her husband's success. She told Trent to stop playing nice and use whatever leverage he could find to force me out. My mother's reply was even worse. Brenda stated that my brownstone was a completely wasted asset. She wrote that I lacked the vision to understand true generational wealth and that my sentimental attachment to an old building was jeopardizing the entire family. She suggested that Trent hire aggressive contractors to begin loud, disruptive construction on the adjoining lots to make my living situation unbearable. They did not view me as a daughter or a sister. They viewed me as a stubborn obstacle standing between them and their financial salvation. The level of coordinated malice was breathtaking. I kept reading, pulling up emails where Calvin discussed pulling strings with city inspectors to fine me for imaginary code violations. Trent detailed his plans to block my alleyway access with construction equipment to force my hand. Chloe even suggested planting illicit substances on my property and calling the police. They brainstormed ways to ruin my life with the casual detachment of a corporate board discussing quarterly projections. Every single one of them was fully complicit in the campaign to destroy me. Then I found the final email chain dated just 3 weeks ago. Trent informed Calvin that the zoning board had issued a final strict deadline. If they did not physically secure my lot within 30 days, the entire Oak Ridge project would be completely terminated and the lenders would immediately liquidate Trent's company. The panic in his digital words was palpable. He begged my father for advice on how to handle the situation. My father's response was sent at 2 in the morning. It was just one single chilling sentence. Clear the lot by any means necessary. We will handle the fallout. Clear the lot by any means necessary. He did not explicitly order the arson, but he absolutely authorized the utter destruction of my life. He gave Trent the green light to employ aggressive, catastrophic tactics and promised to protect him afterward. That was exactly why Calvin had threatened to cut me out of the family trust at the country club this morning. He was making good on his promise to handle the fallout and control the narrative. They were a coordinated criminal enterprise operating under the guise of a respectable, wealthy family. The sickening reality settled heavily in my stomach. My own flesh and blood had actively conspired to leave me destitute, homeless, and potentially dead. I took a deep breath, forcing my emotions back down into the dark, locked box inside my mind. I could not afford to break down now. I had a job to do. I highlighted every single email, every financial document, every bank transfer, and every architectural blueprint. I downloaded the entire massive file into a secure, encrypted hard drive. I made 3 separate digital backups, storing them on isolated remote servers that my family could never trace or access. I needed to ensure that this evidence was completely indestructible. Once the transfers were complete, I wiped my search history, erased my digital footprints, and closed the incognito browser. I pulled the silver flash drive from my workstation and grabbed my heavy winter coat from the rack. I left my office, locked the heavy mahogany door, and took the elevator down to the deserted lobby. I hailed a cab and directed the driver straight back to the police precinct. The ride across the city felt entirely different this time. The burning anger had been replaced by a cold, calculated determination. I walked directly into the precinct, ignoring the bustling activity of the uniformed officers and civilians. I bypassed the front desk entirely and marched straight down the corridor toward Investigator Sterling's office. His door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and walked inside. Sterling was sitting at his cluttered desk, reviewing a stack of preliminary forensic reports. He looked up, surprised by my sudden reappearance. I did not say a word. I simply dropped the silver flash drive directly onto the center of his desk. I pulled up a rigid plastic chair and sat down, crossing my arms over my chest. I coldly explained exactly what I had just discovered, detailing the hidden bankruptcy, the strict zoning laws, the denied permits, and the damning family emails. Sterling listened in absolute silence, his expression growing darker with every sentence I spoke. He plugged the flash drive into his computer and opened the decrypted email archives. He spent the next 20 minutes reading the exchanges, scrolling through the financial ledgers, and examining the architectural blueprints. The only sound in the small office was the steady clicking of his mouse and the distant ringing of telephones in the bullpen outside. When he finally looked up from the monitor, his eyes were wide with grim realization. He exhaled a long, heavy breath and leaned back in his chair. "We have them," he stated, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "We have the exact financial motive, the physical evidence at the scene, and the entire documented conspiracy. This is a slam-dunk federal racketeering case. Maya, do you want to press charges immediately?" I smiled, staring at the bright glow of the computer screen. The faces of my mother, my father, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law flashed through my mind. They thought I was weak. They thought I was beaten. "Not yet," I whispered, my voice echoing with pure, chilling ice. "Let them think they have won. I want everything." I left Investigator Sterling's office with a concrete plan forming in my mind. The drive to my parents' sprawling estate in the affluent suburbs gave me exactly 45 minutes to perfect my performance. I needed to look like a woman who had just had her entire world shattered by the crushing weight of an insurance fraud investigation. I pulled down the vanity mirror in the back of the town car and aggressively rubbed my eyes until they were red and bloodshot. I messed up my hair, letting it fall in a tangled, chaotic mess around my shoulders. I stripped away the cold, calculated armor I had worn at the precinct and wrapped myself in a cloak of manufactured despair. When the car pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Caldwell estate, I was physically trembling. I paid the driver in cash and walked up the long, sweeping driveway, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of my family's manufactured perfection pressing down on me. I reached the massive oak front doors and bypassed the polished brass doorbell. Instead, I pounded on the heavy wood with the flat of my palm, letting out a choked, desperate sob. I knew exactly who would be inside. Sunday afternoons were strictly reserved for family strategy sessions, and my newly discovered digital espionage confirmed they never missed a meeting. The heavy door swung inward, revealing my mother Brenda. She was wearing a pristine ivory cashmere sweater and holding a crystal wine glass. Her expression of mild annoyance instantly morphed into a mask of performed maternal concern when she saw my disheveled state. "Maya, what on earth is going on?" she demanded, ushering me into the grand foyer. "You look absolutely dreadful today." I let out a loud, ragged gasp and practically collapsed against the entryway console table. I buried my face in my hands, forcing my shoulders to shake violently. "The insurance company," I choked out, my voice muffled by my fingers. "They froze my claim, Mom." "The police brought me in for questioning. They think I burned down the brownstone for the money. They think I committed arson." My performance was met with a heavy, pregnant silence. I peeked through my fingers and saw Calvin stepping out from his mahogany-paneled study. Chloe and Trent were right behind him. The entire syndicate was gathered in the foyer, watching their carefully orchestrated destruction play out exactly as they had planned. I could practically see the triumphant satisfaction radiating from Trent's smug face. He had lit the match, and now he was watching me burn. Calvin crossed his arms over his chest, adopting the stern, patriarchal posture he utilized to dominate every room. "We warned you about living beyond your means, Maya," he stated, his voice cold and devoid of any genuine empathy. "We told you that crumbling property was a financial black hole. Now look at the mess you have created for yourself. I am completely ruined." "Dad," I cried, dropping my hands and looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. "The investigator said I might face federal fraud charges. My consulting firm accounts are being scrutinized. The bank is threatening to call in my entire business loan because the brownstone was listed as collateral. I do not have the capital to fight a prolonged legal battle and rebuild. I have absolutely nothing left." Chloe stepped forward, clutching Trent's arm in a display of sickening solidarity. She looked me up and down with barely concealed disgust. "I told you this would happen, Maya," she sighed, shaking her head dramatically. "You always try to prove you are so fiercely independent, but you always end up needing us to clean up your spectacular messes. It is honestly exhausting." I swallowed my pride, bearing the urge to scream the truth at her hypocritical face. "You are right," I whimpered, forcing my voice to crack. "I was stupid. I was in over my head, and now I'm going to lose everything. The city is threatening to seize the lot if I do not clear the debris and pay the municipal fines. I do not even have the cash to hire a demolition crew." Trent squeezed Chloe's hand and stepped into the center of the foyer. The grand savior had finally arrived to claim his prize. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt and looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity. "Maya, listen to me," Trent said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "We are family. Despite our differences, we are not going to stand by and let you go to prison or declare bankruptcy. That would be a stain on all of us. I know things look incredibly bleak right now, but there is a way out of this nightmare." I looked up at him, widening my eyes in a perfect imitation of desperate hope. "What do you mean, Trent? How can I possibly fix this?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "As you know, my development company frequently deals with distressed properties. It is a massive headache, and the profit margins are terrible, but we have the infrastructure to handle municipal fines and debris clearance. If the city seizes your lot, you get absolutely nothing. But if I buy the lot from you directly, it gets the property off your hands immediately." I stared at him, letting my mouth fall open slightly. "You want to buy the brownstone lot." "I do not want to buy it," Trent corrected smoothly, shaking his head. "It is a toxic asset, Maya. The land is covered in toxic ash. The zoning is a nightmare and the municipal fines are compounding daily. From a strict business perspective, touching that property is financial suicide. But I am willing to take the massive hit to my portfolio to help my sister-in-law out of a terrible bind. I watched him spin his web of lies with genuine awe. If I had not read the decrypted emails proving he was functionally bankrupt and absolutely desperate for my specific plot of land to save his entire company, I might have actually believed his performance. He was a masterful sociopath. How much I asked, keeping my voice small and trembling. How much can you offer me? Trent exchanged a swift calculating glance with Calvin before turning back to me. Given the severe environmental damage and the pending legal complications, I can offer you $30,000 in cash. I will also assume full responsibility for all the pending municipal fines and handle the demolition crews. That $30,000 will allow you to hire a decent defense attorney for your insurance fraud investigation and get you a fresh start. $30,000. My historic brownstone had been independently appraised at over $2.4 million before the fire. The land alone was worth at least $1.5 million due to the aggressive commercial rezoning in the district. Trent was offering me pennies on the dollar for a property he absolutely required to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial plaza project. It was the most insulting, predatory lowball offer I had ever heard in my entire career as a financial consultant. I forced a fresh wave of tears to spill down my cheeks. 30,000, I repeated, letting my voice waver with manufactured heartbreak. Trent, the land alone has to be worth more than that. I cannot rebuild my life on $30,000. I need to pay off my business loans. Calvin slammed his hand down on the entryway table, the sharp crack echoing through the grand foyer. Do not be ungrateful, Maya, he barked, his face flushing with manufactured outrage. Trent is offering you a financial lifeline while you are drowning in a sea of your own reckless mistakes. He is actively willing to absorb your toxic debt to protect the Caldwell family name from your impending criminal trial. You have zero leverage here. You take the deal, or you face federal prison and total bankruptcy completely alone. I shrank back, cowering away from my father's booming voice. The sheer cruelty of their coordinated attack was breathtaking. They had orchestrated the destruction of my home, frozen my insurance, and were now using the resulting terror to extort my most valuable asset. They were standing in a circle around me, operating as a unified syndicate of psychological abuse. Chloe crossed her arms, her diamond engagement ring catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Honestly, Maya, you should be on your knees thanking Trent right now, Chloe sneered. He is taking a massive personal risk just to save you from your own stupidity. No one else would ever touch that burned-out lot. You are incredibly lucky he is so generous. I looked at the floor, letting my shoulders slump in total manufactured defeat. I needed them to believe they had completely broken my spirit. I needed them to rush the paperwork and commit their fraudulent extortion to writing. The moment Trent signed that purchasing contract, he would officially link his failing shell company directly to the Arson site. He would hand me the final piece of physical evidence required to execute a federal racketeering charge against all four of them. Okay, I whispered, staring at the marble floor. Okay, Trent. I will take the deal. I just want this nightmare to end. Trent's chest visibly expanded with victorious pride. He could barely contain the triumphant smirk twisting his lips. I will have my legal team draft the purchasing agreement tonight, he said smoothly. We can execute the transfer of the deed first thing tomorrow morning. I will even bring the cashier check directly to the signing. You are making the right choice, Maya. My mother stepped forward, her cashmere sweater brushing against my soot-stained sweatpants. She reached out and firmly grasped my chin, forcing me to look directly into her cold, calculating eyes. She did not offer a hug or a single word of maternal comfort. Instead, she delivered the final psychological blow designed to ensure my total submission. You look at your brother-in-law, Brenda commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. You look at the man who is saving you from a prison cell, and you say thank you. You show some genuine gratitude for his extreme generosity, Maya. This family is bailing you out for the very last time. I stared into my mother's eyes, seeing the absolute void where parental love should have resided. I thought about the decrypted emails stored safely on my encrypted hard drive. I thought about her calling me a wasted asset. I thought about my father authorizing the destruction of my home by any means necessary. I thought about the crushing federal indictments I was about to drop directly onto their perfectly manicured lives. I swallowed hard, forcing a pathetic, trembling smile onto my face. I turned to look at Trent, who was standing tall and proud, relishing his total victory over my existence. "Thank you, Trent," I whispered, ensuring my voice sounded utterly broken and defeated. "Thank you for taking everything off my hands. You have no idea what this means to me." Calvin stepped forward, pulling his bespoke suit jacket tight. He looked down at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. His eyes showed no remorse for the fact that he authorized the fiery destruction of my historic home. "You need to understand the magnitude of what Trent is doing, Maya," Calvin stated, his voice booming. "You have spent your entire adult life continually making careless, unforgivable mistakes. You refused to listen when we told you that acquiring that specific property was a massive, unpredictable liability. You ignored our financial advice. And now, through your sheer incompetence, you have brought a federal fraud investigation right to our immaculate doorstep. I warned you repeatedly that living in that neighborhood was a mistake." Calvin continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you had to play the rebellious daughter. Look exactly where your fierce independence has finally gotten you. You are literally standing here covered in ash, desperately begging for mercy from the very people you constantly push away. The insurance investigators already know you are massively overleveraged. They know you are completely desperate. And frankly, Maya, they are not entirely wrong. You are nothing but a massive walking liability right now." I absorbed his words. He was clearly projecting his own deep desperation onto me. He was the one secretly funneling stolen millions into a doomed commercial project, yet he stood there arrogantly lecturing me on basic fiscal responsibility. I intentionally kept my face buried deeply in my hands, letting my shoulders heave dramatically to sell the illusion. Behind my fingers, my eyes remained dry and furious. "Trent is generously offering you a totally clean slate," Calvin continued without pausing, pacing back and forth like a judge delivering a harsh sentence. "He is willing to take on a toxic asset, risking his pristine corporate reputation simply to bail you out today. If you had possessed even a single ounce of familial duty, you would have gladly sold him that lot many months ago. But your incredible stubborn arrogance somehow led you right here." Chloe scoffed, stepping closer to her husband. She immediately shot me a withering look filled with pure venom. "Honestly, Dad, I do not know why Trent is even bothering with this," she sneered aggressively. "Maya has always been profoundly ungrateful. She will simply take the $30,000 and completely squander it on some other pathetic failed venture. She truly does not appreciate exactly how much extreme pressure Trent is currently under. With his real estate projects yet, he still finds time to act like her personal savior. We really should just let the city immediately seize her toxic property and be done with her exhausting drama forever." I slowly lowered my hands forcefully, willing my eyes to look appropriately bloodshot and filled with absolute manufactured terror. "I am so grateful," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am so incredibly grateful. I just feel so lost. The federal insurance investigators are actively threatening to seize absolutely everything. I do not want to go to prison." Brenda stepped sharply forward, her overwhelmingly expensive perfume wafting heavily over me. "Then you will quietly do exactly as Trent says," my mother ordered, her tone turning completely icy. "You will officially sign the property over today, you will graciously take the money, and quietly resolve your pending legal issues. This prominent family has already suffered more than enough public embarrassment." I immediately looked directly at Trent. He was practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction. He believed he had completely crushed my spirit. He genuinely believed his horrific, cowardly arson plot had worked flawlessly. He arrogantly believed he was mere weeks away from successfully breaking ground on the massive Oak Ridge commercial plaza, completely securing his ultimate financial salvation directly upon the smoking ashes of my former life. I will sign all the papers, Trent, I said quietly, intentionally letting a pathetic, broken sob escape from my throat. I will sell you the lot today, but I just have one single request. Trent's victorious smile immediately faltered, his cold eyes narrowing with deep, sudden suspicion. A request, he repeated slowly. Maya, you are clearly in absolutely no position to be making demands. This is a strict take it or leave it lifeline. It is not a demand, I pleaded, clasping my hands in total submission. It is just a request about the official signing. I want to sign the final transfer deeds at your investor gala next Friday, I said, keeping my gaze locked on his face. Trent's annual charity gala was his absolute crown jewel. It was a massive event held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. He gathered his wealthiest backers and high society elites to showcase his projects and stroke his monumental ego. It was the perfect venue for a public execution. Why on earth would we do that? Chloe demanded. That gala is the most important night of the year for Trent's company. We do not want you looking like a disaster. In front of his corporate partners, you will just embarrass us. I shook my head frantically. No, Chloe, please listen. I will get myself together. I will wear a proper gown. I want to do it there because I want to publicly thank Trent. I turned back to him, injecting pure worship into my eyes. Trent, you are saving my life. You are saving me from federal prison. I want to stand up in front of your investors, your lenders, and the city council. I want them to know that when your sister-in-law was at her lowest, you sacrificed your own profit margins to save her. It will show your backers that you are not just a brilliant developer, but a fiercely loyal family man. It is the absolute least I can do to repay your extreme generosity. Trent stared at me, his suspicious frown slowly melting into a look of greedy contemplation. I knew exactly how to play him. Trent possessed a malignant narcissism that required constant public validation. The idea of being praised as a benevolent savior in front of the financial institutions he was currently defrauding was an intoxicating proposition. He desperately needed to project an image of supreme stability to keep his creditors from looking closely at his books. A public display of extreme philanthropy would be the perfect smokescreen for his ongoing financial crimes. Calvin nodded slowly. Actually, Trent, that is not a terrible idea, my father murmured, rubbing his chin. A public display of family unity and corporate philanthropy would play extremely well with the zoning board members attending the gala. It creates a powerful narrative. Trent straightened his posture, puffing out his chest. The bait had been taken. It is highly unusual to conduct a property transfer during a social event, Trent mused. But considering the extreme circumstances, I suppose, my legal team can arrange for the final documents to be prepared for the gala. Thank you, I gasped, wiping fake tears from my cheeks. Thank you so much, Trent. I will not let you down. See that you do not, Brenda snapped, turning away from me as if the sight of my relief disgusted her. Now go home and clean yourself up. Wait, Trent said, raising a hand. We should get the preliminary paperwork out of the way. Right now, I happen to have a standard distress acquisition contract in my briefcase. We can sign the letter of intent today, which will allow me to immediately dispatch my demolition crews to your lot and start dealing with those municipal fines. The final binding transfer of the deed will happen at the gala. Trent turned and walked toward Calvin's study, returning a moment later with a sleek leather portfolio. He unzipped it and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He clicked a heavy gold pen. He held it out to me with a victorious smirk. Sign on the dotted lines, Maya, he instructed, placing the contract on the entryway console table. And let me worry about the toxic wasteland you left behind. I took the heavy gold pen from his outstretched hand, my fingers trembling exactly as a defeated woman's fingers should. I looked down at the dense legal text printed on the crisp white paper. To my family, I was staring at my own total surrender. I was signing away my property for absolute pennies, resigning myself to poverty and submission. But as I leaned over the console table, my eyes darted across the paragraphs, completely ignoring the horrific financial terms of his lowball offer. I was not reading the purchase price. I was not looking at the liability waivers he had inserted to protect himself from the environmental damage. I was aggressively scanning the fine print, the corporate entities listed as the purchasing agents, and the hidden financial clauses. Trent was utilizing a very specific shell company to acquire my lot. In order to legally authorize the immediate demolition, he was promising the preliminary contract had to disclose the primary financial guarantors backing the shell entity. He had to prove to the city he possessed the liquid capital to clear the site. My eyes locked onto a dense paragraph tucked near the bottom of the third page. There it was. The exact names of the three massive institutional lenders holding Trent's catastrophic debt, along with the precise routing details of the corporate trust my father was using. I carefully signed the blank dotted line. I realized this wasn't just Trent acting alone. I need to know how deep the rot goes. The moment I walked out of my parents' estate, the trembling, pathetic facade I had worn so perfectly vanished. I had exactly 1 full week remaining until Trent's investor gala. 7 days to dismantle his financial empire before I stepped up to the microphone. The preliminary contract Trent had so arrogantly handed me was the final key to his total destruction. He thought he was trapping me in a legally binding corner, but he had actually handed me a highly detailed map of his vulnerabilities. The fine print listed the two institutional lenders holding his catastrophic debt, Mid-Atlantic Financial and Crestview Capital. Back at my office, I went to work. I had spent the last decade building a boutique financial consultancy firm from the ground up. My family loved to mock my career, oblivious to the reality that my client roster consisted of ruthless hedge fund managers. I restructured their toxic assets, saving them hundreds of millions. They owed me massive favors. It was time to call them in. I initiated a video conference with Marcus Vance, a private equity partner who considered me his secret weapon. I laid out the exact financial architecture of Trent's Commercial Plaza project. I showed Marcus the hidden bankruptcy, the compounding municipal fines, and the fatal zoning deadlines. Marcus was a shark, and he instantly smelled the blood in the water. Trent was a sinking ship, completely over-leveraged and incredibly desperate. I directed Marcus to utilize his offshore shell company Obsidian Holdings to act as my proxy. I transferred my liquid capital, supplemented by a line of credit. Marcus extended directly into the Obsidian accounts. We immediately approached Mid-Atlantic Financial and Crestview Capital. Trent's lenders were already in a state of suppressed panic. He had missed his last 3 interest payments, and the municipal zoning deadline was a massive red flag. They knew the Plaza project was teetering on the edge of collapse, operating behind Obsidian Holdings. I made them a highly aggressive, unrefusable offer. I proposed to purchase the entirety of Trent's distressed commercial loans, assuming all associated risks, in exchange for a quiet offloading of the debt. The bank executives jumped at the financial lifeline. They were thrilled to dump the toxic asset before it triggered a catastrophic default on their quarterly reports. The digital ink dried on the transfer agreements 48 hours later. The exhilarating weight of the transaction settled over me as the confirmation email pinged in my inbox. I sat back in my leather office chair, staring at the glowing monitor. I had quietly, ruthlessly acquired every single penny of Trent's outstanding corporate debt. I was no longer just the annoying sister-in-law standing in the way of his grand real estate vision. I was legally his absolute primary creditor. I proudly owned his loans. I owned his collateral. I effectively owned his entire development company, and he had absolutely no idea. If he missed a single payment or violated a single clause in those loan agreements, I had the absolute legal authority to liquidate his assets and seize his company. But financial ruin was simply not enough. I needed criminal accountability. I needed him to burn exactly the way he had burned my home. I needed the rest of my treacherous family to be dragged down right alongside him. I left my office and drove directly to the police precinct to meet with Investigator Sterling. He was waiting for me in the main conference room, the heavy blinds pulled tight against the afternoon sun. The final official forensic reports regarding my historic brownstone were spread across the large table. Sterling slid a thick bound document toward me. His expression was a mixture of professional satisfaction and grim determination. We got the absolute confirmation we needed. Sterling stated, his voice low and serious. The fire marshals officially concluded their deep chemical analysis. The specific accelerant used to douse your property was a highly restricted industrial-grade chemical solvent. It is not something you can just buy at a local hardware store. I scanned the highlighted sections. We cross-referenced the chemical signature with recent commercial purchases in the tri-state area. 2 weeks before your house burned to the ground, a massive bulk order of that exact chemical solvent was purchased by a secondary contracting firm. We followed the money trail. That contracting firm is a wholly owned subsidiary of Trent's primary development company. The purchase order was authorized using the exact same corporate routing number we found in the encrypted emails you provided. The paper trail was flawless. Trent had used his own corporate accounts to purchase the accelerant, completely tying his company directly to the arson. The evidence was irrefutable. Sterling leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the conference table. We have officially secured the arrest warrants for Trent, Calvin, Brenda, and Chloe. Charges include racketeering, arson, insurance fraud, and extortion. The DA is fully prepared to tear their entire syndicate apart. They are looking at decades in federal prison. We can send the tactical units to their estate right now. I shook my head, closing the heavy forensic file. No, I replied, my voice echoing with icy, calculated control. If you arrest them at the estate, they will immediately call their high-priced defense attorneys. They will spin a narrative of victimhood. They will use their immense wealth to quietly post bail and bury the story in the news cycle. They thrive on controlling the environment and hiding behind closed doors. I am not going to give them that luxury. Sterling watched me closely. What exactly do you have in mind, Maya? I want you to execute the arrest warrants tomorrow night, I told him, holding his gaze. Tomorrow night is Trent's annual investor gala. He is gathering the wealthiest elite city council members and prominent financial backers in the grand ballroom of the Regent Hotel. He plans to stand on stage and publicly accept my property, pretending to be a generous savior, while he secretly plans to build his plaza on the ashes of my life. I want you to walk into that ballroom and snap the handcuffs on his wrists in front of every single person he is currently trying to impress. I want his complete destruction to be agonizingly public. A slow, appreciative smile spread across Sterling's face. He understood the profound psychological impact of the strategy. A high-profile, extremely public arrest would instantly obliterate their social standing and send an undeniable message to their remaining investors. I will coordinate with the tactical teams, Sterling agreed. We will stage plainclothes officers around the perimeter of the ballroom. You give the signal from the stage and we will move in and secure the targets. The next 24 hours passed in a state of absolute hyper-focused preparation. I finalized the transfer documents for Trent's debt, ensuring every legal loophole was sealed shut. I worked with my legal team to draft a series of immediate asset seizure notifications. I was preparing a financial execution. The night of the gala finally arrived. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel suite, staring at my reflection. I had discarded the soot-stained sweatpants and the pathetic, trembling demeanor I had worn at my parents' estate. Tonight, I was wearing a stunning, tailored designer dress in a deep, striking emerald green. The fabric moved like liquid silk, perfectly hugging my frame. My hair was styled in sleek, aggressive waves, and my makeup was flawlessly sharp. I looked like a woman who commanded respect, wealth, and absolute authority. I looked like the executioner my family desperately deserved. The heavy, sweet door clicked open and my closest colleague and fiercely loyal friend, Keisha, walked into the room. She was wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and holding a thick, rigid legal folder against her chest. She had been instrumental in coordinating the rapid acquisition of Trent's debt. She walked up behind me, meeting my eyes in the large mirror. Keisha held out the thick legal folder. Inside were the heavily certified documents proving my absolute ownership of Trent's commercial debt, alongside the finalized damning arson report provided by investigator Sterling. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the immense, exhilarating power radiating from the folder. They had tried to break me, but they had only succeeded in forging a weapon that would shatter their entire fraudulent dynasty. Keisha watched me carefully, a fierce, proud smile playing on her lips. She handed me the thick legal folder, the weight of it settling perfectly into my hands. "Ready?" she asks, her voice buzzing with electric anticipation. I zip up the back of my stunning tailored designer dress, smoothing the emerald fabric over my hips. I turn to face her, my eyes blazing with cold, calculating fire. I clutch the folder tightly, feeling the pulse of absolute victory thrumming through my veins. I smile. I am about to burn their entire world down. The Regent Hotel ballroom was a breathtaking monument to manufactured prestige and corporate arrogance. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of the city's most influential financial figures. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated relentlessly with trays of vintage champagne and caviar. Every single detail was meticulously curated to project an illusion of absolute wealth. I stepped out of the private elevator with Keisha right beside me, the thick legal folder clutched securely in my hands. The emerald silk of my tailored designer dress moved flawlessly with every step. I felt a massive surge of calculating adrenaline pumping through my veins. For years, I had walked into these opulent family events, feeling like a burdensome outsider desperate for a sliver of validation from people who fundamentally despised my existence. Tonight, I walked into their territory as the executioner. Across the expansive room, the Caldwell family syndicate was proudly holding court. Calvin stood near an ice sculpture projecting the image of a patriarch. He laughed at a city zoning commissioner, his hand resting on his shoulder. Brenda was glowing, holding a glass of champagne and parading Chloe around to a group of socialites. Chloe was dripping in heavy diamond jewelry that I now legally knew was financed by fraudulent commercial loans and desperate credit extensions. They looked like untouchable royalty. They looked invincible. Trent was the undeniable star of the evening, surrounded by a tight circle of mid-level investors he was desperately trying to woo. He flashed his charismatic smile, expertly selling them the magnificent lie of the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza. He truly believed he was just moments away from securing the final influx of capital he desperately needed to cover his massive debts. He had no idea I was his primary creditor. Keisha leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper over the live classical music. "I am going to find the AV booth," she murmured, her eyes scanning the perimeter of the ballroom. "Give me exactly 10 minutes to secure the video feed, then make your move." I nodded once, watching her slip seamlessly into the bustling crowd of elites. I took a deep breath and began my slow, deliberate walk toward the center of the room. Conversations stopped as I glided past the high-top tables. The guests openly stared at my striking transformation. My mother was the first person to spot me. Her practiced smile instantly vanished, replaced by a panicked scowl. She excused herself from the socialites and marched directly into my path, gripping my bare arm with bruising force. "Maya, what on earth are you wearing?" Brenda hissed, keeping her voice incredibly low to avoid drawing unwanted attention. "You are supposed to be playing the grateful grieving victim tonight. You look like you are trying to upstage your sister. This is highly inappropriate." I pulled my arm out of her rigid grasp, keeping my expression perfectly composed and utterly cold. "I am simply dressing for the momentous occasion, Mom. Trent is saving my life, remember? I just want to represent the Caldwell family properly." Calvin materialized silently beside us, his dark eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. "You will stick strictly to the script, Maya," my father ordered, his tone laced with a cold threat. "You will walk up there when Trent calls you, express your profound gratitude for the $30,000, and step down immediately. Do not embarrass us tonight, or I swear I will let the federal investigators tear you apart." "Come on." I smiled, a chilling, hollow curve of my lips that made my father briefly hesitate. "Do not worry, Dad," I promised softly. "I am going to give Trent exactly what he deserves." Before Calvin could decipher the hidden meaning behind my words, the ballroom lights dimmed dramatically. A hush fell over the massive crowd as a blinding white spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the room. Trent jogged confidently up the velvet-lined stairs, his teeth gleaming perfectly under the lights. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Trent raised his hands high, soaking in the adoration with sickening arrogance. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trent boomed into the microphone, his deep voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Tonight is not just about celebrating the profitable future of urban development. It is about celebrating the core traditional values that make our city great: vision, integrity, and above all else, family." He paced the wide stage, working the wealthy crowd like a seasoned politician. "The Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza is going to be the absolute crown jewel of our downtown revitalization project. But as many of you already know, ambitious progress often comes with unexpected, truly tragic obstacles. Just a few weeks ago, a terrible fire completely destroyed a historic property right in the center of our development zone." A collective murmur of sympathetic whispers rippled through the attentive audience. Trent placed a hand over his heart, projecting an expression of meticulously manufactured sorrow. "That destroyed property belonged to my sister-in-law, Maya. She lost absolutely everything in that devastating blaze. The municipal fines were piling up daily, the insurance companies were freezing her out, and she was facing total ruin." Trent paused effectively, letting the heavy dramatic tension build perfectly throughout the silent ballroom. "But in the Caldwell family, we never abandon our own. I could not simply stand by and watch her drown in insurmountable debt. So despite the massive environmental liabilities and the severe financial risks to my own personal portfolio, my company stepped in. We are officially purchasing her ruined lot to permanently relieve her of that crushing burden. We are clearing the toxic ashes, paying the municipal fines, and giving her a totally clean slate." The ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Investors nodded in visible approval of his magnificent philanthropy. Calvin and Brenda beamed with supreme pride, their faces glowing with undeniable triumph. Chloe actually wiped a fake tear from her powdered cheek. They were publicly cementing their fraudulent legacy right in front of my face. I did not wait for his official cue. I bypassed my furiously glaring parents, walking purposefully down the main center aisle. The heavy legal folder felt like a loaded weapon in my trembling hands. The massive crowd parted instinctively, their loud applause faltering slightly as they noticed my unscripted, highly determined approach. I climbed the velvet stairs, my emerald dress flowing dramatically behind me. Trent's triumphant smile wavered noticeably as I stepped firmly into the blinding circle of the spotlight. He quickly covered his microphone with his large hand, his eyes flashing with sudden panicked rage. "What the hell are you doing?" "Maya," Trent hissed through tightly gritted teeth. "I have not called you up yet. Get back down there." I ignored his desperate whisper entirely. I stepped directly into his personal space and firmly gripped the heavy metal microphone stand. I pried his clutching fingers off the rod with a forceful strength that clearly shocked him. He could not fight back physically without causing a massive public scene. He stepped back defensively, his face flushing dark red with violently suppressed fury. I adjusted the microphone, looking out over the expansive sea of wealthy investors, city officials, and my thoroughly horrified family. Calvin had taken a rigid step toward the stage, his face a mask of pure impending violence. Brenda was clutching her heavy pearl necklace, her eyes wide with total panic. Chloe looked like she was about to scream. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting calmly across the silent ballroom. "My brother-in-law Trent is far too modest. He paints a touching picture of familial duty and corporate generosity. He wants you to believe he is absorbing a toxic asset out of the goodness of his heart." I turned to look at Trent, flashing him a smile that held absolutely no warmth. "Trent, I am incredibly grateful for your generous $30,000 offer. Your willingness to buy my destroyed home for a fraction of its worth is a testament to your unique business strategies." A loud murmur of shocked confusion washed through the crowd. $30,000 was an insultingly low number for prime downtown real estate, and the investors instantly knew it. Trent's jaw clenched, his eyes darting frantically toward the darkened wings of the stage. I did not come here to sign a contract. I continued lifting the heavy legal folder so that everyone in the massive room could see it clearly. I came to show my true appreciation. Trent worked incredibly hard hiding the catastrophic financial reality of the Oak Ridge Plaza from all of his loyal investors. I felt it was my absolute duty to boldly share exactly what he kept dark. I looked toward the AV booth at the back of the hall. Keisha gave a thumbs up. I snapped my fingers loudly. Let us look at the real numbers behind his magnificent generosity. I said clearly. The screen behind him went completely black. The massive digital display stretched across the entire back wall of the grand ballroom remained pitch black for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the room was absolute heavy, with the suffocating anticipation of a crowd that knew it was about to witness a spectacular execution. Trent stared at the dark screen, his breathing shallow and rapid, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He knew his meticulously constructed world was standing on the precipice of total annihilation. Then the screen exploded into stark, blinding white light. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed through the cavernous ballroom as the digital projection materialized. It was not a rendering of the majestic Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza. It was not a chart showing projected quarterly returns or glowing community impact statements. It was a high-resolution scan of the official Municipal Fire Marshal's forensic arson report. The document was stamped with the bright red seal of the city investigator's office, completely undeniable in its stark bureaucratic authority. I had explicitly instructed Keisha to highlight the most damning paragraphs in bright, inescapable yellow. The magnified text practically screamed at the audience of elite investors. The report detailed the exact chemical signature of the highly restricted industrial-grade solvent used to ignite the catastrophic blaze that destroyed my historic brownstone. It stated in plain clinical language that the fire was a deliberate, calculated act of extreme malice. Right beside the forensic report, a second image appeared on the massive display. It was a crystal-clear, digitally enhanced still frame, extracted from a hidden security camera located in the alleyway directly behind my property. The bright white timestamp in the bottom right corner marked the exact time of the fire's violent ignition. 2:34 in the morning. The image clearly showed a sleek, dark gray luxury SUV aggressively accelerating out of the narrow alley, its tires kicking up a cloud of debris. The license plate was perfectly legible, blown up and magnified in a separate box on the screen. It was Trent's personal vehicle. The very same luxury SUV his development company leased for his exclusive use. Finally, a third image transitioned onto the screen, completely dominating the right side of the projection. It was a brilliantly lit macro photograph, taken inside the police precinct evidence room. The image displayed a heavily charred, partially melted titanium money clip resting on a sterile white examination table. The custom engraving on the damaged metal was still perfectly visible, despite the intense heat it had endured. The initials TRC were carved into the titanium in an elegant, unmistakable script. Trent Robert Caldwell. It was the exact money clip my sister had proudly commissioned for him as a lavish anniversary gift 3 years ago. The hundreds of wealthy guests, city council members, and high society elites packed into the ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and scandalized whispers. The sound swelled into a deafening roar of absolute shock. The elite investors who had been shaking Trent's hand and praising his visionary brilliance just moments ago were now pointing at the enormous digital screen in sheer horror. They were looking at indisputable physical evidence of a severe felony. They were looking at the true monstrous reality behind the generous philanthropic facade he had just spent 20 minutes projecting. Trent visibly crumbled. The arrogant, untouchable developer persona he wore like a bespoke suit completely disintegrated right in front of my eyes. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin an unnatural, sickly shade of gray. A thick sheen of nervous sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming harshly under the bright stage lights. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but absolutely no sound came out. He staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the stage carpet. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution order being signed and sealed. He was totally, completely paralyzed by the sudden brutal exposure of his crimes. From the front row of VIP tables, a piercing, hysterical shriek sliced through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Chloe leaped out of her chair violently, knocking over a crystal champagne flute in her desperate haste. The expensive glass shattered against the polished hardwood floor, but she did not even blink. She practically lunged toward the edge of the elevated stage, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her heavy diamond jewelry rattled as she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You are absolutely insane, Maya," Chloe screamed, her shrill voice completely unhinged, easily carrying over the loud murmurs of the horrified crowd. "Turn that screen off right now. This is a pathetic, disgusting setup. You photoshopped every single one of those images because you are deeply jealous of my husband's incredible success. You are a bitter, hysterical liar trying to ruin the most important night of our entire lives." Someone shut her microphone off immediately. I looked down at my furious sister, my expression remaining completely composed and icy. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I leaned closer to the microphone, letting my calm, steady tone amplify across the massive room. "You can try to scream over the truth, Chloe, but it will not alter the forensic reality." I stated clearly, ensuring every single investor heard my words. That arson report was officially filed by the municipal fire marshal this very morning. That security footage was authenticated by the digital forensics team at the Central Police Precinct. The metadata is entirely intact and completely verifiable. And that custom titanium money clip is currently sitting in a sealed, tamper-proof evidence bag under the direct supervision of Investigator Sterling. You cannot Photoshop a federal crime scene, Chloe. Your husband burned my home to the ground because he was incredibly desperate for the land, and he was careless enough to drop his favorite toy while fleeing the scene. Chloe let out another frustrated, animalistic shriek, stomping her expensive heel against the floor. She desperately grabbed Trent's ankle, trying to shake him out of his paralyzed stupor, begging him to defend himself, to say something that would magically erase the enormous digital evidence looming over them. But Trent remained completely silent, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits, calculating a pathetic escape route that did not actually exist. He knew there was absolutely no coming back from this specific level of exposure. Suddenly, a heavy, forceful movement at the side of the stage caught my attention. Calvin was charging up the velvet-lined stairs. My father had abandoned his posture of calm, patriarchal control. His face was flushed, a deep, dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He was moving with a terrifying, aggressive momentum, his dark eyes locked onto me with an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. He was entirely desperate to seize control of the rapidly deteriorating situation, to physically shut down the broadcast of his family's absolute disgrace. Calvin lunged across the wooden stage, his large hands reaching aggressively for the heavy metal base of the microphone stand. He intended to rip the equipment away from me, to completely silence my voice and force the audience to focus on him. He expected me to cower. He expected me to revert to the compliant, broken daughter who desperately sought his validation. He expected me to silently accept the punishment for daring to challenge his absolute, unyielding authority. He was profoundly mistaken. I swiftly stepped backward, expertly evading his aggressive, reaching grasp. I kept a firm, unyielding hold on the microphone, ensuring it remained perfectly positioned near my mouth. Calvin stumbled forward slightly, his momentum throwing him off balance when his hands met empty air. He recovered quickly, stepping aggressively into my personal space, his imposing figure trying to physically intimidate me into absolute submission. "You will stop this completely insane, humiliating display right now, Maya," Calvin commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl intended only for my ears. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. You are completely destroying the Caldwell family legacy in front of the most important people in this city. You are making a massive catastrophic mistake. Turn that screen off and get off this stage immediately before I ensure you never work in the financial sector again. I will absolutely ruin you for this betrayal. I stared directly into the dark, furious eyes of the man who had explicitly authorized the total destruction of my life. I saw no remorse, no parental love, and no hesitation. I only saw a ruthless corporate tyrant desperately trying to protect his fraudulent empire from total collapse. He did not care that I could have died in the fire. He only cared about the public optics of his immediate situation. The last remaining fragile thread of my familial loyalty snapped, completely severing my emotional connection to him forever. "The Caldwell family legacy is a complete and utter lie, Dad," I replied, my voice projecting through the microphone for the entire ballroom to hear. The crowd gasped again as they realized the confrontation was broadcasting live. "You built an empire on manipulation, coercion, and psychological abuse. You look at me and you see a massive liability. You see a broken, helpless daughter you can easily control and extort, but you vastly underestimated exactly who you were dealing with." Calvin reached for my arm again, his fingers curling into tight claws determined to physically drag me away from the podium. He was completely blinded by his own frantic desperation to silence the devastating truth. He opened his mouth to deliver another harsh, booming command, entirely confident that his absolute authority would ultimately prevail. I stepped quickly out of his reach, moving gracefully away from his furious grasp. I shifted my stance, projecting absolute untouchable power. I reached down to the podium and placed my hand firmly on the thick, rigid legal folder Keisha had handed me just moments before. I smoothly opened the heavy cardboard cover. I slowly flipped open the rigid cardboard cover of the secondary folder. Calvin immediately stopped dead in his tracks. My father was a calculating man who truly respected leverage above all else, and the sheer confidence radiating from my posture finally penetrated his blinding, destructive rage. He recognized the heavy, notarized seal of a Supreme Court financial injunction resting in my palm. He took a hesitant step back, his hands dropping to his sides as the terrible, inescapable realization washed over him. I was not acting on raw emotion. I was executing a meticulously calculated, devastating corporate slaughter. I turned away from my father, completely dismissing his presence, and locked my gaze on the sea of elite investors sitting in the grand ballroom. These were the men and women Trent relied upon to float his extravagant lifestyle and fund his doomed projects. They were currently staring at the stage in absolute horror, whispering frantically to one another as the reality of the arson evidence burned into their minds. I raised the microphone, my voice slicing through their panicked chatter with absolute, unwavering authority. "Trent Caldwell has stood before you tonight and presented himself as a visionary developer," I announced, pacing slowly across the edge of the stage. "He has asked you to pour your hard-earned capital into the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza. He has sold you a beautiful, glittering fantasy of urban revitalization and guaranteed double-digit returns. But Trent is not a visionary. Trent is a desperate, drowning man who is currently using your money to plug the catastrophic holes in his completely insolvent corporate portfolio." I quickly signaled Keisha at the back of the magnificent room. The massive digital screen behind me shifted almost instantly. The arson report vanished, replaced by a sprawling, incredibly dense spreadsheet of Trent's private corporate accounts. The bright red numbers highlighted across the screen were staggering. "Look closely at the screen behind me," I instructed the silent, captivated audience. "These are the internal, unedited ledgers of Trent's primary development firm. As you can clearly see, he is completely overleveraged. He has defaulted on his last 3 major interest payments. He is facing millions in compounding municipal fines. The Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza is not a lucrative development opportunity. It is a massive financial sinkhole, and Trent brought you here tonight to unknowingly fund his ultimate bankruptcy." A loud roar of furious outrage erupted from the investor tables. Men in expensive suits were suddenly standing up, their faces red with fury, demanding immediate answers. Trent staggered forward, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Do not do this. We can fix this privately. We can make a deal." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed across the ballroom. "You do not have the capital to make a deal, Trent. You do not even own your own debt anymore." I pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from my legal folder and held them high above my head. 2 days ago, Mid-Atlantic Financial and Crestview Capital quietly sold off your toxic defaulting loans to an offshore private equity entity named Obsidian Holdings. They offloaded your garbage debt for pennies on the dollar just to scrub their quarterly reports. Trent stared at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had taken the stage 20 minutes earlier. "Obsidian Holdings is not some anonymous offshore conglomerate," I stated, letting a triumphant smile spread across my face. "Obsidian Holdings is a proxy firm that I directly control. I bought your debt, Trent. I own every single one of your outstanding loans. I am legally your absolute primary creditor." The ballroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer magnitude of the trap I had sprung was finally registering with everyone in the room. Chloe was weeping openly now, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Calvin looked physically ill, his hands gripping the edge of the stage for support as he realized his precious son-in-law was totally, irreparably ruined. "Yesterday in my father's office, you arrogantly handed me a preliminary contract," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "You demanded that I sign away my destroyed property for $30,000. You thought you were forcing me into a corner. But you were so desperate, so blinded by your own narcissism, that you did not even bother to read the actual documents your lawyers prepared. You did not read the disclosure forms required for the immediate demolition permits." Trent shook his head rapidly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No," he whispered. "No, that is impossible." "I did not sign a property transfer deed yesterday," I declared, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a final sentence. "I utilized my authority as the primary holder of your defaulted corporate debt. I signed the immediate binding foreclosure notice on your entire real estate portfolio. I seized your company, Trent. I seized your assets, your bank accounts, and this ridiculous fraudulent plaza project. You own absolutely nothing." Trent dropped to his knees right there on the polished hardwood stage. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing sob that echoed loudly through the microphone I was holding. He was completely broken, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom, all in one swift, devastating stroke. The wealthy investors in the audience were already scrambling toward the exits, pulling out their cell phones and furiously dialing their personal attorneys and wealth managers. They were desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic fallout of the Caldwell Syndicate. The grand, opulent gala had transformed into a frantic, chaotic evacuation. Calvin turned away from the stage, refusing to even look at me. He grabbed Brenda by the arm, trying to pull her toward the rear exit, desperate to escape the overwhelming public humiliation. But before they could even take 3 steps, a sound pierced the chaotic noise of the ballroom. It started as a faint wail in the distance, growing rapidly louder and more piercing by the second. The unmistakable shrill scream of police sirens. The heavy double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst open violently. Investigator Sterling marched into the room, flanked by a dozen heavily armed, uniformed police officers. Their tactical gear and stern expressions stood in stark, jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers and the formal evening wear of the remaining guests. Sterling scanned the chaotic room, his eyes instantly locking onto the stage. He gave me a sharp, acknowledging nod before directing his officers forward. "Nobody leave the room," Sterling commanded, his voice booming with undeniable federal authority. The remaining guests froze, instantly terrified by the sudden influx of armed law enforcement. Sterling walked purposefully down the center aisle, marching straight toward the stage. He did not even glance at the weeping Chloe or the pale, trembling Calvin. He stepped up the velvet stairs and walked directly over to Trent, who was still kneeling on the floor in a state of absolute shock. "Trent Robert Caldwell," Sterling announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "You are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and federal extortion. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Trent did not move. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his destruction. Two incredibly strong, heavily uniformed police officers stepped forward without hesitation, hauling him forcefully to his feet and roughly snapping heavy steel handcuffs securely around his trembling wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot through the entirely silent ballroom. Trent's head hung low, his shoulders slumped in total agonizing defeat as they began to march him off the stage. The officers began clearing the stage, leading Trent toward the waiting patrol cars outside. As I turned to gather my legal folders, a frantic figure rushed up the stairs. Brenda threw herself at me, her fingers desperately grabbing the emerald silk of my sleeve. Her face was streaked with tears, completely stripped of her usual haughty arrogance. She was trembling violently, her eyes wide with a pathetic begging desperation. "Maya, please!" my mother sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully. "Please, you have to stop this madness. We can give you the money back. We can buy you a beautiful new house anywhere you want. Just call off the lawyers. Call off the police. You cannot do this to us. We are your family." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel profoundly small and worthless. I felt absolutely no pity for her sudden despair. I reached down and firmly detached her gripping fingers from my arm, pushing her hand away with cold, deliberate finality. I looked her dead in the eye. "We were never family. You were just a bad investment." The aftermath of the Regent Hotel Gala was swift, brutal, and utterly absolute. Trent was denied bail immediately. The federal prosecutors piled on the charges with devastating efficiency: racketeering, first-degree arson, massive corporate fraud, and extortion. The media had an absolute field day, plastering his terrified, handcuffed face across every major news network and financial publication in the country. The grand vision of the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza evaporated overnight, leaving nothing but an empty crater in the downtown district. The institutional lenders, deeply grateful that I had taken the toxic debt off their hands before the scandal broke, watched from a safe distance as I systematically dismantled Trent's entire corporate structure. I seized his company assets, liquidated his heavy construction equipment, and froze every single one of his business accounts. Chloe's luxurious, heavily fabricated reality shattered instantly. The federal investigators did not care about her exclusive country club memberships or her highly curated socialite image. They cared that her heavy diamond jewelry, her designer cars, and her sprawling mansion were all financed by stolen funds and illicit credit lines. I watched the live news coverage from my office as federal agents carried boxes of documents and seized assets directly out of her pristine driveway. She was left with absolutely nothing, entirely dependent on overwhelmed public defenders and the fleeting hypocritical pity of her former friends. But the most devastating and poetic collapse belonged to Calvin and Brenda. My parents had spent their entire lives projecting an impenetrable image of untouchable financial supremacy. They had relentlessly judged, mocked, and alienated me for lacking their ruthless fiscal discipline. Yet in their blind arrogance and their desperate desire to see Trent elevate their social standing, they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had secretly leveraged their entire retirement portfolio to back Trent's failing business. They had quietly signed as primary guarantors on his hidden commercial loans, completely convinced that the Oak Ridge Plaza would yield unprecedented returns. When I foreclosed on Trent's company, the massive financial shockwave hit my parents directly. The banks moved swiftly, seizing their sprawling gated estate to cover the catastrophic shortfall. Their pristine credit evaporated. Their elite social circle abandoned them entirely. They were thoroughly, completely ruined. 3 weeks after the gala, my office phone rang. Keisha's voice came through the intercom, laced with a mixture of disbelief and deep resonant satisfaction. Maya, you have two uninvited guests in the lobby. They are demanding to see you. Security is standing by. I did not need to ask who it was. I smoothly adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, sat back in my high-backed leather chair, and instructed Keisha to send them in. The heavy mahogany doors of my office swung open. Calvin and Brenda walked in, but they were almost unrecognizable. My father, a man who had always worn bespoke suits like armor, looked shrunken and frail in a poorly fitted off-the-rack jacket. The aggressive, commanding posture he had maintained his entire life was completely gone. My mother looked even worse. Her signature confidence had vanished, replaced by a hollow, desperate exhaustion. The golden couple of the downtown elite had been reduced to trembling beggars. They stopped in front of my massive desk, looking around at the sleek, modern architecture of my firm. They had never once visited my office. They had never once acknowledged my success. Now they were staring directly at the physical manifestation of the daughter they had completely underestimated. Maya, Calvin began, his voice lacking any of its usual booming authority. It was thin, shaking with profound, inescapable humiliation. We need to talk. We really need your help. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany surface. This is a private financial consultancy firm, Calvin. I charge $800 an hour for corporate consultations. State your business quickly, or I will have security escort you to the elevators. Brenda stepped forward, her hands trembling violently as she clutched a cheap synthetic handbag. The heavy diamond rings she used to flash at dinner parties were notably absent, likely sold to pay for their immediate legal retainers. Please, Maya, do not speak to your father that way. We have lost absolutely everything. The bank took the estate this morning. The federal agents have frozen all of our remaining liquid assets. We have nowhere to go. Chloe is staying in a filthy motel, and Trent is facing 20 years in federal prison. And why exactly is any of this my concern? I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. You made a series of incredibly poor investments. You blindly backed a fraudulent developer. You authorized the complete destruction of my property. In the financial sector, we call that a catastrophic risk assessment. We are your parents, Calvin pleaded, his voice breaking as he placed his hands flat on my desk. It was the exact same posture he had used to intimidate me at the gala, but now it just looked pathetic and weak. We made severe mistakes. We were misled by Trent. He lied to us about the core financials. He promised us the plaza would cover everything. We did not know he was going to burn your house down. We swear to you, Maya, we did not know he would go that far. You knew exactly what he was. I countered, my eyes locking intensely onto his. You knew he was desperate, and you actively encouraged him to crush me because I was a convenient obstacle to your wealth. You stood in your grand entryway while I was covered in the toxic ash of my own home, and you told me I was a walking liability. You told me I was a massive embarrassment. You ordered me to take his insulting, predatory offer and disappear. Brenda let out a ragged, ugly sob. We were just trying to protect the family. We thought Trent was providing a lifeline. Maya, please. We cannot survive on the street. We just need a short-term loan. Just enough liquid cash to secure a cheap rental apartment on the edge of town while the lawyers sort out the asset freezes. You have millions in capital now. You seized Trent's entire portfolio. You can easily afford to help us. Please find it in your heart to forgive us. I stared silently at the woman who had birthed me. I remembered the night of the fire with absolute crystal clarity. I remembered standing on their pristine driveway, smelling like smoke and devastation, having lost every single thing I owned in the world. I remembered asking them for basic help, for temporary shelter, for a fraction of the parental love they showered endlessly on my sister. And I remembered exactly what they gave me in return. I slowly opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek leather wallet. I unzipped the main compartment, my movements deliberately slow and unhurried. I extracted a single crisp bill. I placed it flat on the polished wood of my desk and slowly slid it across the surface until it stopped right in front of my mother's trembling hands. It was a single $100 bill. Calvin stared down at the money, his face contorting with fresh outrage and deep burning shame. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with indignity. "We are asking for a bridge loan to put a roof over our heads, Maya. This is an absolute insult." "This is a precise accounting," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly icy whisper. "That is the exact amount of cash you shoved into my hand the night my house burned to the ground. That is what you determined my life, my safety, and my dignity were worth. You gave me $100, told me to take a taxi, and told me to figure it out. So here is your generous lifeline. Take the $100, go find a cheap motel, figure it out." Brenda stared at the bill, her chest heaving as the brutal reality of my absolute rejection set in. There would be no magical forgiveness. There would be no familial bailout. They had torched the bridge, and I had simply scattered their ashes to the wind. I pressed the silver intercom button on my desk. "Keisha, please send security in right away. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell are leaving the premises. Ensure they are escorted to the street and that they do not return." Within seconds, two large, imposing security guards entered the office. They did not touch my parents, but their heavy presence was a clear, undeniable command. Calvin looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of total defeat and lingering resentment. He snatched the $100 bill off the desk, his massive pride finally breaking under the crushing weight of his absolute destitution. He turned and walked out the door, his shoulders hunched in surrender. Brenda followed him, weeping silently, not daring to look back at me. I watched the heavy mahogany doors close firmly behind them, sealing them out of my life forever. I never rebuilt the historic brownstone. The plot of land held far too many toxic memories, and I had absolutely no desire to construct my future on a foundation of family betrayal. Instead, I waited until Trent's federal indictment became official, effectively clearing the entire downtown development zone of his fraudulent claims. The commercial district was suddenly wide open, and major corporate players were circling the prime location like vultures. I held a ruthless blind auction for the real estate lot. I successfully sold the property to a massive international rival developer for an astronomical 8-figure sum. It was substantially more capital than Trent or my father had ever seen in a single transaction. The sale completely cemented my status, not just as a brilliant financial consultant, but as a major, untouchable player in the city's elite real estate sector. I took the massive profits and completely elevated my own existence. 2 months later, I stood on the sprawling glass-enclosed balcony of my brand-new ultra-modern penthouse. The spectacular city skyline stretched out before me, a glittering ocean of lights, reflecting brilliantly off the dark, churning river. The night air was cool and crisp, entirely free of the suffocating ash and smoke that had defined my recent past. I leaned against the thick glass railing, feeling the deep, resonant hum of the city vibrating beneath my feet. Keisha stepped out onto the balcony, the sound of her heels clicking softly against the expensive stone tiles. She handed me a tall crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. The bubbles danced perfectly in the low light. She clinked her glass against mine, the clear, bright chime ringing out into the night air. We did not need to say a single word about the Caldwells. They were ghosts completely erased from the narrative of my ultimate success. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the champagne, looking out over the sprawling empire I had conquered and the new life I had violently claimed for myself. They had intended to burn me to the ground, to reduce me to absolutely nothing. But I didn't just survive the fire. I became the inferno.